Hey guys, welcome back to Sleep into Power. I am NJ. Now I want you to imagine, for the space of a single slow breath, that you are standing on a shoreline at the very edge of morning. The sky above you is the color of pale ash, softening towards rose. Beneath your feet, the sand is cold and damp, packed hard by the night tide, and the water that slides towards you and withdraws again carries the faint mineral scent of salt and weed and old stone. Somewhere behind you, in the darkness that has not yet given itself up to day, a horse shifts its weight and sighs. The sea before you is called the Aegean. It is very quiet at this hour. Long, low swells move across it without hurry, and where the first light touches them, they turn briefly to hammered metal before falling dark again. Out on that water, drawn up in a line that stretches further along the beach than your eye can comfortably follow, lie ships. Hundreds of them. Their hulls are black with pitch. Their prows are painted with eyes so that they might see their way home. They rock gently against their moorings, timber creaking against timber, and the sound of it carries across the shallows, like the breathing of something enormous and asleep. And beyond the ships, beyond the wide plain of grass and marsh and slow brown rivers, beyond the scattered smoke of cooking fires that have burned in the same places for so many years that the earth beneath them has turned to glass, there is a hill. On that hill stands a city. You cannot see it clearly yet. The morning mist lies across the plain in soft grey banks, and the city floats above it, half revealed, a crown of walls and towers catching the sun before the world below has warmed. But you can see enough. You can see that the walls are high and sloped and built of dressed limestone, and that they lean inward as they rise, so that no ladder can rest flush against them. You can see the dark mouths of the gates. You can see, on the highest point, the roofline of a temple, and above it a thin thread of smoke rising perfectly straight in the windless air, which means that somewhere inside those walls, a fire has been lit, and a prayer is being made. The people who live there have their own name for the place. The Greeks who have camped on this beach for 9 long years call it Ilios. They also call it Troy. 3,200 years from this morning, in a world those people could not begin to imagine, human beings will still be telling the story of what happened here. They will tell it in languages that do not yet exist. They will paint it on the sides of jars and carve it into marble and set it down in books and put it onto screens of glass. Children who have never seen the Aegean will know the names of the men and women who walked these beaches. Armies will name their strategies after them. Doctors will name the tendon in your heel after one of them. And still, after all of that, we will not be entirely certain whether any of it happened at all. That is the strange and beautiful problem at the heart of tonight's journey. Was there really a Trojan War? Did a Greek fleet truly cross this sea in anger and camp on this shore and burn this city to its foundations? Was Helen a real woman, or an idea that men invented to explain why they went to war? Was Achilles a warrior, or a song? And if some of it is true, which parts? Where exactly does the memory end and the poetry begin? How does a real event, fought by real people who bled and were frightened and wanted to go home, become a legend so enormous that it outlives the civilization that produced it by 3,000 years? We are not going to answer those questions immediately. Some of them we will not answer at all, because nobody can. But we are going to walk towards them slowly, in the way you walk towards something in a dream. And by the time we reach the end of this night, you will have traveled through the whole of it. The palaces of Mycenae, with their lion gate and their deep shaft graves, the markets of Troy, and the smell of cedar and olive oil, the wedding where a golden apple was thrown, the oath sworn over the body of a horse, the 9 long years on this beach, the quarrel that began it all, and the funeral that ended it. And then the archaeologists, with their trowels and their notebooks and their arguments, digging down through 46 layers of burnt city to find out what is actually there. Before we begin, let me say a proper welcome. Thank you for being here. Wherever you are listening from tonight, whatever hour it happens to be where you are, Whether it is late evening and the house has finally gone quiet, or the small hours when sleep has slipped away from you and you have come looking for a voice to bring it back, you are very welcome. You have not arrived somewhere you need to keep up with. Nothing tonight is going to demand anything of you. You can let your attention drift and come back and drift again, and the story will still be here, moving at the pace of the tide. If you are new to this channel, and you find that this sort of thing suits you, then do consider subscribing, so that the next journey finds its way to you without your having to look for it. And if you have been here a while, then thank you. It genuinely matters. This particular episode exists because you asked for it. Tonight's subject was suggested by Henry, and by a great many others besides, who have been asking for Troy in the comments for weeks now. That is how this channel works. You suggest, and I read, and slowly the list becomes a library. So if there is a story you have always wanted told this way, leave it below. It will be read. 2 small things and then we begin. The Sleep into Power book is available now on Amazon, if you would like something to sit alongside these journeys. And every documentary on this channel is also on Spotify, for the nights when a screen is the last thing you want. That is all the business there is. So settle back now. Loosen whatever is holding you. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears, and let the weight of your head belong entirely to the pillow. You have nothing to carry for the next few hours. We are going to travel a very long way, into a world of bronze and salt and firelight, of kings who were also farmers, and gods who were also weather. And we will begin, as all of this begins, long before the ships ever came. We begin in the world that made them. To understand why a fleet ever sailed for Troy, you have to understand the world that could build a fleet at all. Go back with me then, not 3,200 years, but a little further. Stand on that same shoreline and turn your back on the sea and walk south and west across the water to the ragged southern hand of the Greek mainland, to a region that will one day be called the Peloponnese. The year, if we must give it one, is somewhere around 1,500 years before the Common Era. The city on the hill has not yet been besieged. The men who will besiege it have not been born, and neither have their great-grandfathers. What you find here is not the Greece of white columns and philosophers. That Greece is 1,000 years in the future, and when it arrives it will look back on this age the way you might look back on a childhood you cannot quite remember, with a mixture of awe and invention. This is something older and stranger. Archaeologists call it Mycenaean, after the greatest of its citadels, and the people who lived in it were the first Greek speakers we can properly identify. Picture the landscape first, because the landscape explains almost everything. Greece is not a country in the way you might picture a country. It is a shattered thing, a scatter of mountains dropped into a sea, and the mountains come down so steeply and so often that the flat land is broken into small separate pockets, each one a day or two of hard walking from the next. Between them lie ridges of limestone, dry scrub, thyme and sage baking in the heat, the resinous smell of pine. There are few great rivers, there is very little easy land, and so there are very few great kingdoms. Instead, there are dozens of small ones, each occupying its own plain, each with a fortress on a defensible hill above it, and a scatter of villages below. Mycenae in the Argolid, Tiryns a short ride away across the flat, Pylos in the sandy southwest, near the sea, Thebes to the north, in Boeotia, Sparta in the deep trench of the Eurotas Valley, hemmed in by mountains, Orchomenos beside its drained lake, Iolkos on its northern gulf, and out across the water on the island of Crete, the older and more sophisticated palaces of the Minoans, whose art and script and religion the mainlanders had spent centuries admiring and copying, and in the end, absorbing. Walk up towards one of those citadels now, and let yourself feel how it was. The path climbs. The heat comes off the stone in waves, and the cicadas make a sound like the air itself vibrating. Above you the walls appear, and they are not like any walls you know. They are made of boulders, enormous, roughly squared blocks of grey limestone, some of them the size of a cart, stacked without mortar into a mass 6 or 7 meters thick. When later Greeks came upon these ruins, in an age when nobody remembered how they had been built, they concluded that no human hands could have lifted such stones, and decided that giants must have done it. They called the masonry Cyclopean, after the one-eyed giants of their stories, and we call it that still. At Mycenae, the road brings you to a gate, and above the gate, set into a triangle of stone, 2 lionesses stand facing each other, with their forepaws on an altar and a column rising between them. Their heads are missing now. They were probably made of some more precious material, and someone took them. But the bodies remain, and they have stood over that gateway for 3,500 years, watching everyone who has ever walked through. Inside, the citadel is crowded. There are storerooms and workshops and the houses of officials, and at the highest point, a palace, which is not a palace, as you might imagine a palace. There is no soaring hall of marble. There is a rectangular room called a megaron, with a great circular hearth at its center, 4 wooden columns rising around the hearth to support a lantern in the roof through which the smoke escapes, and a throne set against one wall. The floors are plastered and painted in squares. The walls are covered in frescoes, and the colors are vivid beyond anything you would expect. Deep blues made from ground stone, ochres and reds, women in flounced skirts with their hair dressed in ringlets, warriors with boar tusk helmets, bulls, griffins, processions carrying offerings. The fire in the hearth is always burning. The room smells of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the perfumed oil that these people made in industrial quantities and traded across the whole eastern Mediterranean. And here is the thing that will surprise you most about this world. It was not isolated. It was not a huddle of chieftains scratching a living from the rocks. It was one node in a network that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. We know this because a ship went down. Off a headland called Uluburun, on the southern coast of Turkey, a merchant vessel sank in the late 14th century, before the Common Era, and lay on the sea floor until sponge divers found it in the 1980s. When archaeologists brought its cargo up, they found the Bronze Age laid out like an inventory. 10 tons of copper, cast into ingots shaped like stretched ox hides, so that a man could carry one on his shoulder. A ton of tin, which is the other half of the recipe. Glass ingots the color of deep water. Ebony from Africa. Ivory, both elephant and hippopotamus. Terebinth resin in hundreds of jars, for incense. Ostrich eggshells. Amber that had come overland all the way from the Baltic. Weapons and tools and jewelry from Egypt, from Canaan, from Cyprus, from Mycenaean Greece. One ship, one voyage, and everything in the known world aboard it. That is the age we are entering, an age of copper and tin, because bronze is what you get when you melt them together, and bronze is the metal that makes everything else possible. It makes the swords and the spearheads and the armor. It makes the chisels that cut the stone, and the saws that shape the ship's timbers, and the razors and the cauldrons and the mirrors. And here is the quiet fact that underlies the entire period. Copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. To make bronze at all, you must trade. You must send ships out and bring them back. You must have relationships, and roads, and harbors, and treaties, and men who speak more than one language. Which means you must also have things worth protecting, and rivals worth fearing. We know a little of how these kingdoms ran themselves, and we know it in an unexpected way. The Mycenaeans wrote. Not literature, as far as we can tell, but accounts. They kept records on tablets of unbaked clay, in a script we call Linear B, and because clay tablets are fragile, they were never meant to survive. What preserved them was catastrophe. When a palace burned, the fire baked the tablets hard, and the accounts of the last year of a kingdom's life came down to us precisely because that kingdom was destroyed. For a long time nobody could read them. Then, in 1952, A young English architect named Michael Ventris, who had been obsessed with the problem since he was a schoolboy, worked out that the language underneath the script was an early form of Greek. It was a genuine shock. It meant these were not a mysterious lost people, but the ancestors of Homer's own tongue. And what do the tablets say? They say how many sheep. They say how much bronze has been issued to which smith, and how much wheat is owed, and how many women are working at the textile sheds, and how much perfumed oil has gone to which sanctuary. They record chariot wheels, some serviceable and some not. They record offerings to gods with names you will recognize. Poseidon, who was evidently very important indeed, and Zeus, and Hera, and Athena, and Dionysus. They are, in other words, unbelievably boring, and that is exactly what makes them precious. Poetry tells you what a people wished to be. Accounts tell you what they actually did. What they did was organize. At the top of each kingdom sat a figure the tablets call the Wanax. Below him a Loagetus, whose title seems to mean something like leader of the people, and who may have led in war. Below them, a layered hierarchy of officials, landholders, village heads, and at the bottom, in numbers, people who were owned. It was a world of hierarchy and inventory and careful accounting, and it was also a world of astonishing violence. The graves tell you that. At Mycenae, in the deep shaft graves that Heinrich Schliemann would open with his own hands in 1876, the dead were buried with swords. Not one or two, but dozens, rapiers a meter long, too slender for hacking, made for the thrust, daggers inlaid with gold and silver and black and yellow, showing lions hunting and men hunting lions, gold cups, gold diadems, and laid over the faces of the men, masks of beaten gold. These were warrior kings, and they wanted the next world to know it. By around 1300, before the Common Era, the mainland was at its height. The palaces were rebuilt larger, the walls were made thicker, roads were engineered across the hills with culverts and bridges, wide enough for chariots. Tombs were built like beehives. Vast domed chambers of corbelled stone approach down a long stone passage, and when you stand inside one and look up at the point where the courses close, you understand that these people could build. They could also reach out. Mycenaean pottery turns up in Egypt, in Cyprus, along the Levantine coast, in southern Italy. Mycenaean settlers or traders established themselves on the Anatolian coast, at Miletus and elsewhere, right on the doorstep of a much greater power inland, and that is the last piece of the map you need tonight. Because Greece was not the only civilization in this story, and it was not the largest. Across the Aegean, occupying most of what is now Turkey, lay the empire of the Hittites, a genuine imperial state, with a capital at Hattusa, a professional army, a written law code, and a diplomatic correspondence, conducted with the pharaohs of Egypt as equals. The Hittites did not much care about the Aegean itself, but they cared very much about the western edge of Anatolia, where a scatter of smaller kingdoms owed them loyalty and frequently failed to provide it. Two powers, then, facing each other across a narrow sea. Between them a coastline of small, wealthy, awkwardly placed cities, and at the very top of that coastline, where the sea narrows to a strait barely a few kilometers wide, on a hill overlooking a plain, sat a city that controlled the only sea road between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. There is a lesson sitting quietly under all of this, and it is worth holding for a moment before we move on. We tend to imagine that great wars begin with great passions, but every civilization that has ever fought a long war has first built the thing that makes long war possible: the ships, the roads, the storehouses, the surplus, the network of obligation that lets one man summon another. The Bronze Age did not go to war because it was angry. It went to war because, for the first time, it could afford to. Let that settle. And now let us go and look at the city. The place we are going has been called many things. The Hittites, writing in cuneiform on clay in their capital far to the east, referred to a land in the northwest that they called Wilusa. The Greeks called the city Ilios, and later Ilion, and it is from that name that the poem takes its title, because the Iliad simply means the song about Ilios. They also called it Troia, and the Hittites, in at least one text, wrote of a place called Taruisa. Two names in two languages, sitting side by side in both. That correspondence is not proof of anything on its own, but it is the sort of thing that makes historians sit up straighter. Whatever you call it, go and stand there. The hill is not dramatic. That is the first thing that surprises people who visit today, expecting something enormous. It is a low spur of rock at the western end of a broad plain, perhaps 25 meters above the fields, with two rivers threading past it towards the sea. The Greeks named those rivers Scamander and Simois. Today they are the Karamenderes and the Dumrek, and they still flood and still lay down silt, and over 3,000 years they have pushed the coastline several kilometers further out than it was, so that the modern ruins sit inland and the sea is a distant blue line. In the Bronze Age, the water came much closer. There was a bay, now entirely filled in, and ships could be drawn up almost beneath the walls. Climb the hill in the early morning, before the heat comes, and look around you. To the north, the land drops away towards the strait. This is the Dardanelles, which the Greeks called the Hellespont, and it is one of the most consequential pieces of water on the planet. It is narrow, in places barely more than a kilometer across, and it is the only way through from the Aegean into the Sea of Marmara and onward to the Black Sea, to the grain lands and the metal sources and the rivers running down out of the steppe. Everything that goes north or south by sea must pass here. And here is the difficulty that made this hill wealthy. The current in the strait runs south, out of the Black Sea, and it runs hard. The prevailing winds in summer blow from the northeast, straight down the throat of it. A Bronze Age ship, square-rigged, with a shallow draft and no ability to sail close to the wind, simply cannot get through against both. It must wait, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Where do you wait? You wait in the shelter of the bay, beneath the city on the hill, and while you wait you buy food, and water, and repairs, and you pay for the privilege of being there. Whoever holds this hill holds the toll gate of the northern world. That is the strategic fact, and you should keep it somewhere at the back of your mind for the rest of the night, because it is the single most plausible reason why anyone would ever have gone to a great deal of trouble to take this place. Helen, if she existed, was a woman. This was a revenue stream. Now walk to the walls. What you meet is genuinely formidable. The great circuit of the citadel, built in the period archaeologists labeled Troy VI, rises in courses of beautifully cut limestone laid in slightly sloping tiers, and the whole face batters inward as it climbs, 4 or 5 meters thick at the base. Above the stone, the wall continued upward in mud brick, and towers stood at intervals, one of them substantial enough to have contained a cistern. There is a great stone ramp leading up to one entrance, still there, worn smooth, and when you walk up it, you find yourself doing what everyone does, which is to put your hand on the wall. The gates were built cleverly. They do not simply pierce the wall. They are set in overlapping sections, so that anyone approaching must turn and pass along a corridor with the defenders above him on his right hand, which is his shield side reversed, exposing his spear arm. Every fortification builder in the ancient world understood this trick. Whoever laid out Troy understood it very well. And here is the discovery that changed the argument about this place, more than any other. For 100 years after Schliemann, most people who thought about Troy pictured what he had excavated, the citadel, and only the citadel. And the citadel is small, perhaps 2 hectares. Impressive, but hardly a great capital. Skeptics use this to dismiss Homer entirely. A poem about a 10-year international war fought over a fortified farmhouse. Then, beginning in 1988, An international team under the German archaeologist Manfred Kaufmann returned to the site and did something Schliemann had not thought to do. They looked outside the walls, using magnetometry, which reads disturbances in the Earth's magnetic field and can trace buried structures without digging. They surveyed the plateau to the south, and they found a city, a lower town, spreading out well beyond the citadel, with buildings and streets and, cut into the bedrock, a substantial ditch that would have stopped chariots and slowed infantry, very probably fronting a defensive wall. Kaufmann argued that the true settlement was many times larger than the citadel alone, perhaps 10 times, and that the population might have run to several thousand people. Be honest about the state of the debate, because it is a real one. Kaufmann's reconstruction attracted sharp criticism, including a well-publicized academic quarrel around 2001, with some historians arguing that he had overstated the size and importance of the lower town and had allowed enthusiasm for Homer to shape his interpretation. The argument has not been fully settled, but the ditch is there, the buildings are there. Almost nobody now defends the old picture of Troy as a mere fortified house. So imagine it properly, not a castle on a rock, but a citadel, with a town spread below it. Inside the walls, the ruler's residence and the temple and the great houses and the storerooms. Below and outside, the workshops and the dwellings and the markets. And beyond those, the fields and the horse pastures for which the city was famous. Because Homer's Troy is never simply Troy. It is always Troy of the fine horses, Troy of the good colts. And if you had walked those plains, you would have seen why. Fill the streets now. There is dust in the air and the smell of it. There is the sharp animal smell of the tanner's quarter, which is always downwind. There is wood smoke and bread and the particular scent of cedar, which came down from the mountains inland and was used for the fine chests and the roof beams and the doors of the wealthy, so that the great houses smelled faintly of forest, even in high summer. There is olive oil, in enormous quantities, because olive oil in this world is not merely food. It is light and soap and medicine and perfume base, and it is traded in painted jars the length of the sea. There are looms. That sound is everywhere in the Bronze Age, and we forget it, because we no longer live in a world where cloth is made, in the room where you sleep. The clack of the loom waits, hundreds of them, in every house, all day. There are languages. Whatever the Trojans spoke at home, and the honest answer is that we are not certain. This was a port at a crossroads. Traders came from the Anatolian interior, and from the islands, and from the Greek mainland, and the market would have been a place where a dozen tongues rubbed against each other, and people made themselves understood with their hands. And there is metal, bronze from the smithies, the tap of hammers, the roar of the bellows, and gold, because there was gold here in quantity. Schliemann found some of it, and what he found was so rich that he did what everyone in this story eventually does. He leapt to a conclusion and gave it a name from the poem, and we will come to that later. Stand at the highest point now, by the temple, and look out one last time. You can see the whole plain from here. You can see the 2 rivers, and the marsh, and the burial mounds standing on the ridges. You can see the strait, and the current running through it, and beyond the water, the low hills of Europe. On a clear day you can see the island of Imbros, and behind it, far off and blue, the peak of Samothrace, from which, in the poem, the god Poseidon sits and watches the fighting on this plain. It is a beautiful place. It is also an exposed one. A city built here is a city that has decided to be rich rather than safe. 9 cities were built on this spot, one on the ruins of the last, across more than 3,000 years, and 46 distinct levels of occupation have been counted. It was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again, by earthquake and by fire and by war, and each time somebody came back, because the position was worth it. Somewhere in that stack of ruins, if it is anywhere, lies the city we came to find. Let the picture hold for a moment. The walls in the early light, the smoke going straight up, the looms starting, the sea beyond, still empty of ships. And now let us go inside and meet the people who lived there. Every story needs a household, and the story of Troy has one of the largest in all of literature. The king's name was Priam. By the time the events of the poem take place, he is an old man, and the poem never lets you forget it. He is described by his years, and by his white hair, and by the tremble in his voice. In a story crowded with men in the fierce middle of their lives, men who can throw a stone that two ordinary men could not lift, Priam is the one who has already been strong, and is no longer, and that turns out to matter more than any of the fighting. Greek tradition gives him an unusual beginning. It says that Troy had been sacked once before, in the previous generation, by Heracles, over a broken promise concerning some horses. In that earlier sack, the king was killed, and almost all his sons with him, and only the youngest boy survived, ransomed by his sister. The name Priam was said to come from that ransom. Treat that as tradition rather than history. But notice what the tradition is doing. It is telling you, before the war even begins, that this city has fallen once already. It is telling you that Priam has spent his entire long life rebuilding something that he watched burn as a child. Every wall he raised, every alliance he made, every son he fathered, was an argument against a memory. And the poem, at its end, will take all of it away from him a second time. Beside him is Hecuba, his queen. She is a harder figure to see clearly, because the epic tradition gives her less space than it gives the men, but what it does give her is unforgettable. She is the mother of the greatest of the Trojan warriors, and she is the woman who will stand on the wall and watch her son run for his life around the city he was born in. Later Greek playwrights, particularly Euripides, took her up and made her the central voice of what happens to a city's women after the men are dead. And in their hands, she becomes one of the most devastating figures in the whole tradition. Their children are, in the poem's account, extraordinarily numerous. 50 sons and a number of daughters, though not all by Hecuba. That figure is not a census. It is a way of saying dynasty, of saying that this is a house that expected to continue forever. You will need to know a few of them. Hector is the eldest of Hecuba's sons, and the heir. He is the one the city depends upon, and he knows it, and the knowledge sits on him like armor he cannot take off. He is married to Andromache. They have one small son, whom the people call Astyanax, lord of the city, because he is Hector's boy, and everyone assumes what that means. Paris is his brother, and he is also called Alexandros, and you should file that second name away carefully, because it will come back when we reach the Hittite tablets. Where Hector is duty, Paris is appetite. He is beautiful and charming, and a superb archer, and utterly unwilling to be what his family needs him to be. Tradition says that before his birth, Hecuba dreamed she gave birth to a burning torch that set the whole city alight, and that the seers understood it, and that the child was exposed on a mountainside to die, and was raised by shepherds instead, and came back. Cassandra is their sister, and hers is the cruelest gift in the story. She was granted true prophecy by the god Apollo, and when she refused him, he did not take the gift back. He simply arranged that no one would ever believe her. She spends the entire war telling the exact truth to people who look away. There is Helenus, who is also a seer and is believed. Deiphobus, who fights well. Troilus, young, who does not live long. And Polyxena, the daughter whose fate at the very end of the story is one of the darkest things in the tradition. Beyond the family there are allies, and this matters. Troy is not alone. Homer devotes a long passage to listing the peoples who came to fight for it, and they come from across Anatolia and Thrace, Dardanians under Aeneas, Lycians from the south under Sarpedon and Glaucus, Carians, Paphlagonians, Phrygians, Thracians from across the strait. Some are kin, most are obligation, or trade partnership, or the calculation of neighboring kings who understand that if this gate falls, they are next. Now let the household become a place. Come through the gate in the middle of a working morning. The passage is dim and the air is instantly cooler. And then you are out into light again, and there is a paved court, and dogs, and children, and a woman carrying a jar on her shoulder, with the particular upright walk that only comes from having done it every day since you were 6. The great houses stand close together and rise in more than one story. Their walls are stone at the base, and mud brick above, plastered and painted. Their doors are heavy timber, and the good ones are cedar, and they turn on stone sockets that have been worn into perfect circles by 3 generations of opening. Inside there are chests, and beds with woven webbing, and wooden stools, and hangings on the walls to keep the cold off. There are lamps of clay, each with a single wick floating in oil, and at night they make a light that is warm and small, and does not reach the corners of the room. The palace itself has a hall with a hearth, and the smoke rises through the roof, and the smell of the fire is in every fabric in the building. Now the religion, because you cannot understand these people without it. It was not a matter of belief in the way you might use that word. It was a matter of relationship. The gods were not distant. They were in the weather and the harbor and the sickness and the harvest, and they had preferences, and they could be offended, and the entire apparatus of ritual existed to keep those relationships in repair. You poured a little wine on the ground before you drank. You burned the thigh bones wrapped in fat so that the smoke went up. You did not begin anything of consequence without asking. The Trojans of the poem worship gods the Greeks recognize, which is itself a curiosity, since it means the poem's Trojans are not foreigners in any deep sense. Chief among them is Apollo, who defends the city fiercely, Athena, who hates it, Aphrodite, who protects Paris because he chose her, Zeus above them all, who loves Troy genuinely, has received more sacrifice from its altars than from anywhere on earth, and will still let it fall, because even he cannot unmake what has been fixed. And here is a detail worth pausing on, because it is one of the strangest small bridges between poem and archive. In the Hittite treaty between their king and a ruler of Wilusa, the gods who guarantee the agreement include one written as a Pali Yunus. Scholars broadly accept that this is a form of the name Apollo, appearing as a deity associated with Wilusa, in a document written centuries before Homer, in a language that is not Greek. That does not prove the Trojan War. It proves something quieter, and in some ways more moving. It proves that a real place in northwestern Anatolia really did honor a god whose name we would recognize, and that some thread, however frayed, runs between the archive and the song. Let us end this chapter at night. The gates are shut and barred. The watch is set on the towers, and the men on duty walk their sections and stamp their feet against the cold coming off the plain. In the houses, the lamps are put out one by one. Somewhere a baby is settled. Somewhere a loom is finally silent. Priam is an old man in a high room, and he can hear the sea. Everything he has, everything he rebuilt from the ashes of his childhood, is inside these walls tonight, breathing in the dark. It will hold for a while yet, but far away, on a green island, a wedding is being prepared, and someone has not been invited. What follows is not history. I want to be entirely clear about that before we begin, because it is one of the most famous stories ever told, and it is also one of the least likely to have happened. This is myth. It is how the Greeks explained the war to themselves, in the way that every culture builds a story to sit behind the story, so that a catastrophe becomes something more bearable than an accident. Hold it as you would hold a beautiful object in a museum case, with attention and with pleasure, and without confusing it for the world outside the window. So, there was a wedding. The bride was a sea nymph called Thetis. The groom was a mortal man, Peleus, king of a small northern people called the Myrmidons. That is already unusual, and the reason for it is worth knowing. Thetis was so lovely that both Zeus and Poseidon had wanted her, and both had withdrawn very suddenly when a prophecy reached them, that whatever son Thetis bore would be greater than his father. Neither god was prepared to father his own replacement. So she was married off to a mortal instead, where the prophecy could do no damage, and the whole of Olympus came down to the celebration. Imagine it as the Greeks did, a green slope on the flank of Mount Pelion, in Thessaly, above the sea. The evening is warm. There are long tables under the trees, and the light comes down through the leaves in coins. There is wine and roasted meat and the smell of crushed grass. A centaur has been invited, an old and famously wise one named Chiron, and he has brought a spear of ash wood as a gift, cut from the summit of the mountain. The gods are here in their proper shapes, gorgeous and terrible, and behaving, on the whole, quite well. Every immortal has been asked, except one. Her name was Eris, and her name simply means strife. She was not asked because nobody in their right mind asks strife to a wedding, and because everyone at the top table understood exactly what she was for, and preferred, that evening, not to have it. So the invitation was never sent, and the wine was poured, and the music started. She came anyway. She did not overturn the tables. She did not curse the marriage. She did something far more elegant and far more damaging, and if you have ever watched a family or an office or a country tear itself in half over something small, you will recognize the technique immediately. She rolled a golden apple into the middle of the party. On it were written 2 words, "To the fairest," that is all. She did not say whom she meant. She did not need to. She left the ambiguity open and let the guests do the rest. And the terrible genius of it is that the apple contains no lie. It states no falsehood and accuses no one. It simply proposes that there is a best and declines to say who. 3 goddesses reached for it. Hera, the queen of heaven, wife of Zeus, the goddess of marriage and sovereignty, and the dignity of a settled order. Athena, born from her father's head, goddess of wisdom and craft, and the disciplined violence of war. Aphrodite, who was desire itself, and who did not have to argue about beauty because she had never once been in a room where the question arose. And they turned to Zeus and asked him to judge. Zeus, who was many things but was not a fool, declined. One of these was his wife. One was his favorite daughter. One was a force he had no defense against. Whatever he said, he would lose 2 of them forever. So he passed the decision to a mortal, and he chose the young man who had been raised among shepherds on the slopes of Mount Ida, above the Trojan plain, Paris, son of Priam. Consider the position he is put in. He is a boy with a flock. He has never been asked to decide anything more consequential than where to move the sheep. And 3 of the most powerful beings in existence arrive on his hillside, and he is told that he must choose between them, and that there is no option to refuse. They do not simply stand and let him look. This is the part the story is really about. Each of them offers him something. Hera offers him power. She will make him ruler over Asia, the greatest king alive, and he will be obeyed from one sea to the other. Athena offers him wisdom and victory. He will be the finest warrior of his generation, never defeated, and he will have the judgment to know how to use it. Aphrodite offers him the most beautiful woman in the world. He chooses the woman. You can hear the whole tradition sighing as he does it. Every Greek listener knew what the correct answer was, and knew that he would not give it, and knew that this is precisely why the story survives. He is offered dominion, and he is offered understanding, and he takes the third thing, because the third thing is warm and immediate, and the other 2 are abstractions. He is not stupid. He is young, and he is human, and he is standing in front of Aphrodite. There is only one difficulty with the prize, and Aphrodite does not raise it. The most beautiful woman in the world is already married. 2 goddesses walked off that mountain having been told, by a shepherd, that they were not enough. And for the rest of the story, whenever the fighting swings towards Troy, you will find Hera and Athena on the other side, working, patiently and without mercy, for the destruction of the entire city and everyone in it. The war that follows is, in the poem's own logic, an act of divine revenge for wounded pride. Now, before we leave this hillside, Let us do the thing this channel always does, and ask what is actually going on here. Because none of this is a report. There was no apple. But myths are not lies. They are compressed arguments. And this one is making a case with unusual clarity. The first thing it says is that the war had no adequate cause. Look at the chain. A slighted guest. A trinket with an ambiguous inscription. A vanity contest. A boy's preference. 10 years of siege, and a city erased, and a civilization shaken, all resting on a beauty competition. The Greeks were not being frivolous when they told it this way. They were saying something bleak and observant about how catastrophes actually begin, not with a great evil, but with a small, unresolved slight that nobody thought worth settling. The second thing it says is about choosing. The three offers are not random. Power, wisdom, love. They are three complete theories of what a life is for, and the story sets them side by side and makes a young man pick one in an afternoon, with no information, no counsel, and no way back, which is roughly how most people make the decisions that shape their lives. And the third thing, quietly, is about exclusion. Everyone at that wedding knew Eris existed. They simply decided not to have her at the table. And what the story observes, coolly, is that strife left off the guest list does not go away. It waits outside and finds another way in. And the way it finds is always more expensive than the invitation would have been. The lamps are low now, the wedding is over, and the guests have gone, and the grass on the mountain is bent where the tables stood. Somewhere south of here, in a valley between two mountain ranges, a woman is going about her day with no idea that any of this has happened. We should go and meet her. Of all the people in this story, she is the one we can see least clearly, and she is the one everybody thinks they know. Helen. Start with where she lived, because Sparta in the Bronze Age is not the Sparta of the school books. The Sparta of black broth and iron discipline and boys stealing food to learn cunning is 700 years in the future. This is the late Bronze Age, and what stood in the Eurotas Valley then was a Mycenaean kingdom like the others, with a palace and a hearth and painted walls and clay tablets recording sheep. But the valley is the same, and the valley is remarkable. You come down into it from the north, and the mountains rise on your left hand so abruptly that they seem unreal. That is Taygetos, and it holds its snow into the early summer, and in the evening the whole eastern face of it turns a color somewhere between rose and violet, while the valley floor below has already gone into shadow. The river runs green and cold. There are reeds along it, and plane trees, and in spring the whole floor of the valley is loud with frogs. Her husband was Menelaus, and here is the political shape of things. Menelaus was the younger brother of Agamemnon, who ruled at Mycenae and was the most powerful king in Greece. So the two brothers between them held the Argolid and the Eurotas, which is to say the two richest plains in the southern mainland. Sparta was not a backwater. It was half of a family holding, and Helen was, by inheritance, its legitimacy. Because Helen did not marry into Sparta. Helen was Sparta. She was the daughter of its king, Tyndareus, and in the tradition, the throne came to Menelaus through her. Keep that in mind, because it changes the arithmetic of what happens next. When Helen leaves, Menelaus does not merely lose a wife. He loses, or risks losing, the claim on which he rules. Now the story as the Greeks told it. Paris came to Sparta as a guest. Everything in the Greek world hangs on that word. Guest friendship, which they called xenia, was not politeness. It was a sacred institution, personally guaranteed by Zeus, in his aspect as protector of strangers. And in a world without embassies or passports or enforceable law between kingdoms, it was the only mechanism that made travel possible at all. A stranger arriving at your door was fed and washed and given a place by the fire before you were permitted to ask his name. In return, he was bound absolutely. Break xenia, and you were not merely rude. You had attacked the one thread holding the whole international order together. Paris was received in the palace at Sparta. He was fed at Menelaus's table and given gifts. And then Menelaus was called away to Crete for a funeral and left his guest in his house. When he returned, Helen was gone, and a good deal of the treasury with her. That is the accusation. And in Greek terms, it is not primarily about desire. It is about sacrilege. Paris did not simply take a man's wife. He took her from inside a relationship that the gods themselves underwrote, which is why the tradition can present the war that follows as something more than a family quarrel. It is a punitive expedition on behalf of a violated principle. But did she go willingly? This is the oldest argument in the story, and the ancient world could not agree on it either. In one version, she is abducted outright. She is taken by force, carried down to the ships, and everything that follows is done to her, rather than by her. In another, Aphrodite's promise is literal and irresistible. The goddess makes her go, and Helen has no more choice in the matter than a leaf has about the wind. And in Homer, she is at one point given a divine order she loathes and obeys anyway. In a third, she went because she wanted to, and regretted it almost immediately. Homer, who is subtler than any of the retellings, does something remarkable with her. He gives her no scene of seduction and no defense. He simply lets you watch her, years into the siege, living in the city her presence has doomed, and what you see is a woman corroded by self-reproach. She calls herself terrible names. She says she wishes she had died before it happened. She weaves the war into a tapestry, which is one of the strangest and most modern images in ancient literature. The cause of the story, sitting in an upper room, making a picture of what her story has cost. And the Trojan elders on the wall, watching her walk past, murmur that no one could blame either side for fighting over such a woman, and then say, quietly, that all the same she should be sent back before she destroys them. She is loathed, and she is protected. Nobody in Troy will give her up, and nobody in Troy forgives her. Later writers went further still. The poet Stesichorus is said to have written an attack on Helen and been struck blind for it, and to have recovered his sight only by composing a retraction claiming she never went to Troy at all. In that version, which Euripides took up and turned into a whole play, the gods sent a phantom of Helen to Troy, while the real woman waited out the entire war in Egypt. 10 years of slaughter over an image. It is a devastating idea, and it tells you how uncomfortable the Greeks themselves became with the story they had inherited. So what do we actually have? Historically, almost nothing. There is no archaeological trace of Helen, and there never could be. What we can say is that in the late Bronze Age, royal women were instruments of statecraft, that dynastic marriages bound kingdoms together across the eastern Mediterranean, and that a marriage alliance broken, or a princess taken to another court, was a genuine casus belli in the diplomatic language of the period. A woman moving between two royal houses without agreement was not a romance. It was a transfer of legitimacy, and it could unmake a treaty. That is as close as the evidence will let us come. It is enough to say that the shape of the story is plausible, even if the woman is not recoverable. There is one more thing to sit with before we move on, and it is the reason Helen has never stopped being interesting. She is the most famous woman in Western literature, and she barely speaks. For 3,000 years she has been described, blamed, desired, excused, argued over, and used, almost always by other people. And the one thing the tradition consistently denies her is a clear account of what she wanted. She is the object over which the whole story is fought, and the story is not curious about her. Homer, to his enormous credit, noticed. That is why his Helen is so uncomfortable to read. He gives her just enough interior life for you to register that there is a person in there, and then he lets the war close over her. Let that rest for a moment. The valley is dark now. The mountains have taken the last of the light, and the river is running somewhere below in the reeds. And in the palace above it, A man has come home to an empty room and is standing in it, working out what he is going to have to do. He is going to have to call in a debt, and the debt is enormous, because years ago, before any of this, when Helen was young and unmarried, and every prince in Greece was at the door, her father was persuaded to make them all swear something. Tyndareus had a problem, and it was a problem of his own making. His daughter was the most sought-after bride in Greece, and the whole of the Greek nobility had come to Sparta to compete for her. That should have been a triumph. It was in fact a crisis, because these were not suitors in any gentle sense. They were kings and princes with warbands, and every one of them was going to lose. Whoever Tyndareus chose, he would be creating a coalition of the disappointed, all of them armed, all of them within a few days' sail. The man who solved it, according to tradition, was the one you would expect. Odysseus had come from Ithaca, a small rocky island off the western coast, and he had come without much hope. He was not rich. His kingdom was, as he cheerfully described it elsewhere, rugged but good at raising young men. What he had instead was the quickest mind in the Aegean, and he had already worked out that he was not going to win, and had turned his attention to what he might get out of losing well. His proposal was this: before the choice is announced, make every suitor swear a binding oath, that whoever is chosen, all the rest will accept it, and further, that if anyone ever attempts to take her from her chosen husband, every man here will come, in arms, to put it right. It is a beautiful piece of thinking. It converts every rival into a guarantor. The moment the oath is sworn, the strongest possible motive each man has to attack the winner becomes the strongest possible reason to defend him. They swore it, tradition says, over the dismembered body of a sacrificed horse, standing on the pieces, which is about as unbreakable as the Bronze Age imagination could make a promise. Menelaus was chosen. Odysseus, for his trouble, was given help in obtaining the woman he actually wanted, Tyndareus's niece Penelope, and took her home to Ithaca, and by any reasonable measure, got the better end of the entire arrangement. And then, years later, a herald arrives on each of their shores. This is the mechanism by which a private injury becomes an international war. Not passion, paperwork, a promise made at a wedding, cashed in a decade on. Let us meet them as they are summoned, because these are the men we will be living with for the rest of the night. Agamemnon comes first, because he takes command. He is king at Mycenae, the wealthiest citadel on the mainland, and Homer's phrase for him is Lord of Men. He is not a bad general. He is brave enough in the field, and he holds a fractious coalition together for the better part of a decade, which is not nothing. But there is something misshapen in him around the question of status. He cannot bear to be seen to yield. He confuses what he is owed with who he is, and because he is the most powerful man present, that confusion costs other people their lives. He is a study in how a leader can be competent and still be a catastrophe. Menelaus is the wronged husband, and he is easy to underrate. He is a decent fighter, and unusually in this company, a decent man. He wants his wife back, and he wants the insult answered, and beyond that he is not hungry for very much. It is one of the small cruelties of the story that the man with the actual grievance is the one nobody follows. Nestor is old. He is king of sandy Pylos, and he has outlived 2 generations, and he speaks, everyone agrees, more sweetly than honey. He is also, quite unmistakably, the man in every meeting who prefaces his advice with a long account of how much better everyone was in his day. And yet his counsel is usually sound, and the moments when the Greeks ignore him are the moments things go wrong. He is the memory of the army, and a reminder that in a world without writing, the old are the archive. Ajax, the son of Telamon, is enormous. He carries a shield like a tower, made of 7 layers of oxhide over bronze, and he is the only Greek in the poem who never once receives supernatural assistance. Everything he does himself. He is slow to speak and slow to anger, and immovable when he plants his feet. And there are long passages in the Iliad where the entire Greek line survives, simply because Ajax has not yet decided to step back. His fate after the war is one of the saddest in the tradition, and it turns entirely on wounded pride. Diomedes is young and quite terrifying. He is the one who, on the maddest day of the war, wounds two gods. He is also, unexpectedly, the most level-headed man in the Greek camp, capable of telling Agamemnon he is wrong to his face and then obeying him anyway. If you were building an army out of these men, Diomedes is the one you would want. Odysseus you have already met. He is the mind. He is sent whenever something needs saying carefully or doing quietly, and he is the only Greek who consistently thinks past the end of the current day. He also, crucially, did not want to come. Tradition says he attempted to avoid the summons by feigning madness, plowing a field with a mismatched team and sowing it with salt, and that the trick was exposed when his infant son was placed in front of the plow and he turned the blade aside. He goes to Troy having tried to stay home, and it takes him 20 years to get back. And then there is Achilles. He is the son of that wedding on Mount Pelion. Thetis is his mother, and the prophecy held, he is greater than his father, greater than anyone. He is the fastest man alive, and the finest spearman who has ever lived. And everyone in the story, on both sides, knows it. The tradition adds the detail everyone remembers, that Thetis dipped him as an infant in the river Styx to make him invulnerable, holding him by one heel. It is worth noting that this particular version is not in Homer at all, and appears in surviving sources considerably later. Homer's Achilles can be wounded. He is simply better than everyone else. What Homer does give him, and it is the engine of the entire poem, is a choice. Achilles knows his own future, because his mother has told him. He has two fates available. He may go home and live a long, ordinary, comfortable life, and die old among his people, and be forgotten. Or he may stay at Troy and die young, and be remembered forever. He knows the terms. He takes the second, and then he spends the whole poem discovering what it actually costs. Now watch the machinery of the summons work. Heralds go out across the Aegean. Ships are counted. Homer will eventually list them, kingdom by kingdom, in a catalogue that runs for hundreds of lines and names more than 1,000 vessels. And that catalogue is one of the most argued over passages in ancient literature, because the political geography it describes matches the Bronze Age rather than Homer's own time, which suggests something very old survived inside the poem. Timber is felled, sails are woven, grain is loaded, smiths work through the summer. In villages on 100 small plains, men who have never been further than the next valley are told that they are going across the sea, and they say goodbye in doorways to people who will not see them again. That is the part the epics rarely stop for, and it is worth stopping for now. Behind every named hero stand several thousand people whose names nobody recorded. They rode, they dug, they carried, they died of infected wounds and bad water, and the ordinary attrition of a decade in a camp. The Iliad is the story of the kings. It is not the story of the army. And here is the reflection to carry with you as this chapter closes. The oath of Tyndareus was designed to prevent a war. That was its entire purpose. It was a clever, well-intentioned mechanism, built by an intelligent man to stop violence before it started. And it worked perfectly for years. And then, when the case it was designed for finally arose, it functioned exactly as written and delivered the largest war in the Greek imagination. Nobody who swore that oath wanted this. They swore it to make peace. But a promise made in one set of circumstances does not know anything about the circumstances it will be called upon in. And by the time the herald arrives, the men who swore are no longer the men who must keep it, and the choice has already been made for them by their younger selves. Let that sit gently. The commitments we make in order to feel safe are sometimes the exact commitments that carry us out of safety. The ships are gathering now, all across Greece. working their way towards a single sheltered bay on the eastern coast. And when they arrive there, the wind will stop. There is a stretch of sheltered water on the east coast of Greece, opposite the long island of Euboea, where the mainland folds inward and the sea lies flat and green and protected. The Greeks called it Aulis. It was the natural place to assemble a fleet bound east, and that is what it became. Try to see the scale of it. 1,000 ships if the catalogue is anything like right, and even if it is a poet's number rather than a quartermaster's, there were a great many. They come in over weeks, in squadrons, each contingent under its own king, each with its own dialect and its own gods, and its own opinion of everyone else. The bay fills. Then the beaches on either side of the bay fill. Then the fields behind the beaches fill. A camp of that size is a city that has appeared overnight and has none of the things a city takes centuries to build. There is no drainage. There is no clean water beyond what the streams provide, and the streams are soon fouled. There is no way to keep men busy. The smell reaches you before the sight does. Wood smoke and tar and latrines and horses, and the sourness of too many people in one place. And there they sit. Because the wind will not come. Day after day the sea lies still. Sails hang. The rowers could pull, but not for that distance. Not across open water with the whole fleet. Not with the stores they had. In a world where every voyage of consequence depends on wind, a flat calm is not an inconvenience. It is a verdict. And in the Bronze Age, a verdict has an author. So the seers are consulted, and the answer comes back that the goddess Artemis is offended, and the reason varies with the telling. In some versions, Agamemnon killed a deer in a grove sacred to her, and boasted that he had shot better than she could. In others, the offense is older, or vaguer, or unexplained. What is consistent is the remedy, and the remedy is monstrous. The fleet will sail when Agamemnon sacrifices his daughter. Her name was Iphigenia. Now, whether or not you know this story, take a moment with the position it creates, because Greek tragedy returned to it again and again and never exhausted it. He is a father. He is also a commander, with a coalition camped around him that is beginning to rot, held together by an oath and by loot that has not yet been won, and if he refuses, that coalition dissolves, and his authority dissolves with it, and he goes home a diminished man. Every option available to him is unbearable. There is no version of this in which he behaves well. And here is the detail that Aeschylus, writing 7 centuries later, would fix upon with terrible precision. Agamemnon does not merely give in. There is a moment in the great choral passage of the Agamemnon where he stops arguing with himself and puts on the necessity like a garment, and after that he does not hesitate at all. The tragedy is not that he was forced. It is that at a certain point he stopped resisting and began to cooperate with the thing that was destroying him. The girl is sent for. The message that brings her from Mycenae says that she is to be married to Achilles, who knows nothing about it, and who, in the version Euripides tells, is incandescent when he finds out his name was used. She comes down to the bay in her wedding clothes. The tradition splits at the last moment. In some tellings, Artemis substitutes a deer at the final instant, and carries the girl away to serve as her priestess in a far country. In others, there is no substitution. Either way, the wind came. The sails filled that same day, and 1,000 ships stood out of the bay, and Clytemnestra, the girl's mother, went back to Mycenae to wait for her husband to return from the war. She waited 10 years, and what she did on the day he came home is one of the darkest scenes in Greek literature, and it begins here, on this beach, in the calm. Let us step back from the story for a moment and put a colder light on it. Human sacrifice in Bronze Age Greece is a genuinely open archaeological question, and the honest answer is that the evidence is thin, contested, and occasional, rather than systematic. There have been finds that some excavators have interpreted as sacrificial, and other specialists have interpreted quite differently. and no consensus exists that this was a normal part of Mycenaean religion. What is clearer is that the classical Greeks themselves regarded it with horror and located it firmly in a barbaric past, which is exactly what you would expect of a practice that was either rare or remembered rather than current. So treat Iphigenia as the Greeks treated her, not as a report of ritual procedure, but as a story a culture told itself about the price of command. It is asking a question that has not aged at all. What is a leader permitted to spend? And if the answer is that he may spend anything, provided the cause is large enough, then what exactly is the cause protecting? Now let the picture soften. The bay is empty, the fires are out, and the ground is churned and scarred where the camp stood, and grass will grow back over it within 2 seasons. The sea is moving again. Somewhere out on that water, in the dark, 1,000 ships are running east, before a wind that arrived exactly when it was needed, and every man aboard them believes he knows why. Let your breathing slow with the swell. Ahead of them is a coastline they have never seen. The crossing takes them island by island, because nobody in the Bronze Age willingly loses sight of land. Picture the way these ships work, because it is nothing like a later warship. The hull is long and shallow, built with the planks joined edge to edge, tenons pegged into mortises with a patience that seems impossible now. There is one mast, taken down when not in use, and one broad square sail. There is no deck to speak of. The crew sits on benches with their gear beneath them and their shields along the rail, and at night, whenever they possibly can, they run the ship straight up a beach, unload, and sleep on land beside it. So the fleet moves in stages, hopping the Cyclades and then the northern islands, and every evening the same ritual: the keels grating up the shingle, the shouted orders, the fires, the smell of barley porridge, the men going down to the water to wash the salt off, someone always singing. And then one morning the coast ahead is not an island. The tradition says they made one serious mistake early, landing in Mycia, further south, and fighting a battle against a people who had done nothing to them under a king named Telephus, and only afterwards discovering their error. It is a small detail and easy to skip. Do not skip it. It is the truest thing in the whole approach. Armies get lost. Fleets make landfall on the wrong shore. A great deal of what happens in war is simply people being in the wrong place with weapons. Eventually they find the right shore. Now, the landing. There is a prophecy attached to it, and it is characteristic of this story that the prophecy is a trap. The first Greek to set foot on Trojan soil will be the first Greek to die. Everyone knows it. So the fleet comes in and the ships ground and nobody moves, and the whole expedition hangs for a moment on a technicality. A man named Protesilaus jumps. He is a minor figure, from Philus in Thessaly, newly married, and Homer gives him a few lines and a devastating image: his house left half built, and his wife tearing her cheeks in it. He goes over the side and up the beach and kills several men, and is killed, and the fleet pours ashore behind him. He is the first name on a list that will run for 10 years. The Trojans contest the beach and lose it, and fall back to the walls, and from that day forward, the shape of the war is set. And here is where almost every retelling misleads you, so let us be careful. The Trojan War was not 10 years of continuous fighting outside the gates. The Iliad, which everyone thinks is the story of the war, covers a period of a few weeks in the 10th year. What lies before it is 9 years of something much less cinematic and much more familiar to anyone who has studied a real siege. It is a blockade, and blockades are mostly logistics. The Greeks cannot take the walls. That should be said plainly. They have no siege engines worth the name, no torsion artillery, no engineering corps. Bronze Age armies were not equipped to reduce a well-built fortification, and the walls of Troy 6 were extremely well built, so they cannot get in, and the Trojans, with the whole of Anatolia behind them and allies still arriving, cannot push several tens of thousands of men into the sea. Two forces, neither able to finish it. So what do? They raid. The Greeks spend those years working up and down the coast and out among the islands, taking the smaller towns that Troy depends on, burning the fields, cutting the supply lines, and carrying off whatever can be carried. Achilles is credited in the poem with sacking a great many places, and this is where the war's economy lives. Not glory, but grain and cattle and bronze and captives. That last word needs sitting with, because it is the ugliest fact in the story, and the poem does not hide it. When a city fell, the men were killed and the women were taken. They became property. They were distributed to the leaders as prizes, according to rank, and they cooked and wove and served in the huts of the men who had killed their husbands. Homer names some of them: Chryseis, Briseis. The entire quarrel that begins the Iliad, the argument that costs so many lives, is an argument between two men over the ownership of two women, and the poem knows this, and expects you to notice. Meanwhile, the camp itself becomes a place. 9 years is long enough for a besieging army to build a town. There are huts of timber and turf, laid out in contingents. There is a wall on the landward side, and a ditch in front of it, thrown up in the 10th year when things get dangerous. The ships are drawn up on the beach in long ranks, and their hulls are drying out and rotting and being patched. And men who came expecting a season's campaign have been here so long that the ropes have been replaced twice. There is illness. There is boredom, which in a camp is more dangerous than the enemy. There are quarrels about the division of loot that go back 6 years. There are men who have children they have never seen. There is a graveyard, growing. And on the other side of the plain, inside the walls, another kind of endurance. Troy is not starving, or the story would be much shorter. The city has land behind it, and allies bringing supplies, and it has water. But it is a city that has not been able to open properly for a decade. Its trade is throttled. The harbors it once taxed are held by the men camped on them. Its young men are dying in 1s and 2s on the plain, and the funerals have become routine, and there is a whole generation inside those walls that has never known the gates standing open in peace. And every day, the two sides come out and fight. That is what the plain is for. A stretch of open ground between the camp and the city, marked by a rise called Batiaea, and a great oak and a fig tree, landmarks so familiar to both armies that they use them like street names. Some days, there is a general engagement. Most days there is skirmishing. Now and then there are duels, formal ones, arranged and watched, because there is a ritual quality to this fighting that is quite unlike a modern battlefield. Let us end this chapter in the 10th year, on an ordinary evening. The fighting has stopped, as it stops most evenings, because nobody fights at night. The dead are being carried off under a truce that both sides observe without discussion. On the Greek beach the fires are lit, and the smell of roasting meat comes off them, and someone is playing a lyre, badly. On the walls of Troy, the watch changes. Between them, in the darkening plain, the grass is growing over 10 years of this. Both sides have long since forgotten what the argument was actually about. It has become the way things are. It has become weather. And into that exhausted equilibrium, one morning, walks an old man with a staff wrapped in the ribbons of a god, asking for his daughter back. Here is the poem. Everything so far has been prelude, told by later writers, filled in by tradition. What follows now is the Iliad itself, and it is worth pausing to say what that means. The Iliad is around 15,600 lines of verse. It was composed to be performed aloud, probably somewhere in the 8th century before the Common Era, roughly 400 years after the events it describes. It was not written by a man sitting at a desk. It came out of a tradition of oral poetry that had been running for centuries, in which singers memorized not texts but techniques, a vast stock of ready-made phrases and scenes that could be assembled and varied in performance. That is why the sea is always wine-dark and the dawn is always rosy-fingered. Those phrases are not decoration, they are the joinery. Whether one person called Homer shaped it into what we have, or whether the name stands for a tradition, has been argued for 2,500 years and will not be settled tonight. And the astonishing thing about this poem, given everything, is what it chooses to be about. It does not begin with the apple. It does not begin with Helen or the ships or the landing. It begins in the 10th year, and it announces its subject in the first word. And the first word is not war or Troy or Achilles. The first word is anger. Sing, goddess, of the anger of Achilles. That is the entire proposal. A poem about a siege that lasted 10 years is going to concern itself with a few weeks, in which one man was so insulted that he stopped fighting. Watch how it starts. A priest of Apollo named Chryses comes to the Greek camp. His daughter has been taken in one of the raids and given to Agamemnon, and he has come to ransom her, and he brings a great price and the sacred staff of his god, and he asks in front of the assembled army. Every man there says yes. It is the obvious thing. Take the money, honor the priest, avoid trouble. Agamemnon refuses, and he refuses cruelly, and he sends the old man away with threats. So the priest walks down the beach alone and prays. And Apollo comes down from Olympus with night on his face, and Homer says his arrows made a sound as he moved, and he shoots into the camp for 9 days. The mules first, and the dogs, and then the men. Plague. The pyres burn continuously. On the 10th day, Achilles calls an assembly, because somebody has to. The seer Calchas will only speak if he is protected, and once protected he says what everyone has worked out. The god is angry. The girl must go back. No ransom. Agamemnon, humiliated in front of the entire army, agrees to return her, and then announces that since he is being deprived of his prize, he will take someone else's instead. He takes Achilles' woman, Briseis. Now, it is very easy to hear that as a quarrel over property, and to feel the whole thing collapse into pettiness. But hold it up carefully, because the poem is doing something precise. In this world, a warrior's worth is not internal. There is no private conscience to fall back on, no God who sees you when nobody else does, no future record. Worth is entirely social. It is the honor paid to you by other men, and it is made visible in things. The share of the plunder, the seat at the feast, the portion of meat. Take a man's prize in public, and you are not stealing from him. You are announcing that he does not count. And Agamemnon does this to the best fighter alive, in front of the whole army, for no better reason than that he can. Achilles nearly kills him on the spot. The poem has him actually drawing the sword, and stops him. Then he does something worse than violence. He withdraws. He takes his myrmidons out of the fighting, and sits down by his ships, and he asks his mother to go to Zeus, and arrange that the Greeks should lose. Not fight badly. Lose. What follows is a long section of the poem in which the Greeks discover, slowly and at enormous cost, what one man's absence is worth. But before we follow it, let us go down onto the plain and look at how these men actually fight, because the Iliad is extraordinarily specific, and most of us carry a picture from films that is not quite right. The core of it is the spear, not the sword, which is a secondary weapon. A man carries 1 or 2 throwing spears, and the standard sequence in the poem is a cast at range, and if that fails, closing with the second. The spearhead is bronze, leaf-shaped, socketed onto an ash shaft. Bronze is softer than iron, and the points bend and are straightened again. The shield is the center of everything. Some are round, some are the great body shields like Ajax's tower, layer upon layer of oxhide faced with bronze, heavy enough that a man could shelter a wounded comrade behind it. Homer spends 400 lines describing a single shield later in the poem, and it is one of the most famous passages in literature. The armor is bronze plate and greaves, and a helmet, and the helmets in the older layer of the tradition are made of rows of boar tusks sewn onto leather, which is not a poetic invention. Boar tusk helmets have been excavated. They are real, and they belong to the Bronze Age, not to Homer's own time, which is one of the strongest arguments that genuinely old material is preserved inside the poem. The chariots are not what you might think. There is no massed chariot charge, as at the great battles further east. In Homer, the chariot is a taxi. It carries a nobleman to the fighting. He dismounts, he fights on foot, and his driver waits nearby to carry him out. Historians have argued for a century about whether this reflects real Mycenaean practice, or a poet's misunderstanding of a weapon that had gone out of use before his time. It may well be the second. The Linear B tablets record chariots in numbers that suggest a serious military arm, not a shuttle service. The fighting itself is not a line of shields grinding forward. That is the later Greek phalanx, and it belongs to a different age. This is a loose, surging individual business, in which champions come out and are recognized by their gear and exchange challenges and sometimes genealogies before fighting, and duels happen inside a general melee that swings back and forth across the plain. And it is intimate, and Homer never once looks away from what a bronze point does to a body. The poem is famous for it. Each death is given specifically, with the man's name and often his father's name, and where he came from, and what he had been doing before he came here. A man who had been a fine runner, a man whose parents were still waiting, a man who had come as a suitor and been promised a daughter. Then a line describing exactly where the spear went in and exactly how he fell. That is the moral engine of the Iliad, and it is the reason the poem has never been surpassed. It refuses the abstraction. Nobody in it dies as a statistic. Every single one is somebody's son, given a face for 2 lines and then taken away. And the accumulated weight of that across 24 books is what makes it, arguably, the greatest anti-war poem ever written by a culture that did not believe in such a thing. Meanwhile, above all of it, the gods. They are not distant. They are on the field. Athena grips a man by the hair to stop him. Aphrodite carries Paris out of a duel he is losing, wrapped in mist. Apollo strikes a man between the shoulders. They argue on Olympus about the outcome. They cheat. They favor. They are wounded and complain. And they are, in the most important way, unlike the humans, because nothing they do costs them anything. They can be defeated and be perfectly well the next morning. They watch men die and go back to their feast. The Greeks called them the deathless ones. And the poem's most quietly radical suggestion is that this is not a promotion. It is what makes them trivial. Only mortals can be brave, because only mortals can lose everything. The gods are magnificent, and they are, in the end, spectators. Achilles knows this better than anyone, because he is half divine, and it does not help him at all. Let the light go down on the plain now. He is sitting by his ships at the far end of the camp, out at the edge of the line, with his men idle around him, and the sound of the fighting drifting up the beach from a battle he has decided not to join. He has a lyre in his hands. Homer gives him that detail, and it is a strange and lovely one. The greatest killer in the world, sitting alone in the evening, singing about the famous deeds of men. He has been right about everything. He was insulted, and the insult was real, and his anger is entirely justified, and it is going to cost him the only person he loves. We need to slow down here, because we have arrived at the part of the story where the poem stops being about a war. Patroclus was older than Achilles. That surprises most people, who imagine him as a younger companion, but Homer is clear about it. He was the elder, and he had come to Achilles' father's house as a boy in disgrace, exiled for killing another child in a quarrel over a game of dice. And Peleus had taken him in and raised him alongside his own son and told him to look after him. So they grew up in the same house, in Phthia, in the north, with the mountains behind and the sea in front. They were taught by the same tutors. They were sent out to the same centaur on the same mountain, in the version where Chiron teaches them medicine and music and the properties of roots. They came to this war together, and they have shared a hut on this beach for 10 years. Homer never labels the relationship, and the Greeks themselves argued about it for centuries afterwards, and the argument continues. Plato's characters discuss it. Aeschylus wrote a play in which they are lovers. Others insisted they were only the closest of friends. The poem itself does something more useful than defining it. It shows you what it looks like from the inside, and then it takes it away, and the size of the whole tells you what it was. Here is what you need to know about him as a man. In an epic populated by the most violent people imaginable, Patroclus is the kind one. That is his defining quality, and Homer marks it repeatedly. He is the one who is gentle. When the poem wants to show you a moment of ordinary decency in the camp, it is usually Patroclus doing it. He treats the captured women well, and later, in one of the most affecting passages in the poem, one of those women will say so out loud over his body. He weeps when he sees the wounded. He listens. He is also the only person alive with any influence over Achilles. So the Greeks are losing, because Zeus has agreed to Thetis's request, and because the best fighter in the world is sitting by his ships doing nothing. The tide of the war has turned completely. The Trojans have pushed out from the walls and across the plain, and Hector is fighting with a kind of inspired ferocity, and the Greeks have been driven back to the ditch they dug in front of their own camp, and then over it. The fighting has reached the ships. Fire is being thrown at the hulls, and if the ships burn, nobody goes home, ever. Before this happens, the Greeks try to fix it. Agamemnon, frightened at last, sends an embassy to Achilles. Odysseus, Ajax, and old Phoenix, who tutored him as a child. They come at night, and they find him with his lyre, and they offer him everything: tripods, gold, horses, 7 cities. Briseis returned untouched. Any daughter of Agamemnon he cares to marry, with a dowry beyond counting. And Achilles says no. And the speech he makes in refusing is one of the most important passages in Western literature, because in it, he does something no character in the tradition has done before. He questions the entire value system. Why, he asks, do we do this? A man's life cannot be taken back once it has passed the barrier of his teeth. Cattle can be raided, tripods can be won, but not a life. He has fought for 9 years, and the same share goes to the man who stayed by the ships. He says the honor is the same for the coward and the brave, and both die alike. He is asking the question the poem has been building towards. If glory is the payment, and glory is just other men saying your name, and you will not be there to hear it, then what exactly has been purchased? He announces he will sail home in the morning. He does not sail. He stays, out of some mixture of pride and inertia, and the knowledge that he cannot actually leave. But he does not fight either, and the ships begin to burn, and Patroclus comes to him, weeping. The image Achilles uses is astonishing. He says Patroclus is crying like a little girl running beside her mother, tugging at her skirt, wanting to be picked up. It is affectionate, and it is impatient, and it is the way you speak to someone you have known your entire life. And then Patroclus asks him for something. If you will not fight, he says, let me. Give me your armor. Let the Trojans see it coming and think you have returned, and they will fall back from the ships out of pure fear, and the men will get a breathing space, and nobody need know. Achilles agrees. He agrees with one condition, and he repeats it, and the repetition is the sound of a door closing. Drive them from the ships, and come straight back. Do not pursue them to the walls. Do not go near Troy. You know what is going to happen. Everyone who has ever heard this story knows. He puts on the armor. It is not quite right for him. There is one piece he cannot take, the great ash spear from Mount Pelion, the wedding gift from Chiron, because no one but Achilles can lift it. And he goes out, and it works. It works completely. The sight of that armor coming across the sand does exactly what they hoped, and the Trojans break, and the fire is put out, and the Greeks come surging back off the ships and out over the ditch and onto the plain. And Patroclus, who has never had a day like this, does not turn around. You can feel the poem tighten. He kills and kills again, and he is magnificent, and he is completely out of his depth. He kills Sarpedon, a son of Zeus himself, and there is a passage where Zeus considers saving his own son, and is told by Hera that he cannot, and weeps tears of blood onto the earth. Even the king of the gods does not get to keep what he loves, and Patroclus drives on to the wall of Troy. He tries to climb it. 3 times he gets his hand on the angle of the rampart, and 3 times something pushes him back, and the 4th time a voice says, "Stop." Apollo is on the wall. The god strikes him from behind, between the shoulders, and the helmet comes off and rolls in the dust under the horse's feet, and the spear breaks in his hands, and the shield strap parts, and the armor of Achilles simply falls off him. That is the way Homer stages it, and it is more terrible than any wound. He is disarmed, undressed, made a boy again in the middle of the field. A Trojan called Euphorbus puts a spear in his back, and then Hector comes. Patroclus dies slowly enough to speak, and what he says is a prophecy. He tells Hector not to boast, that it took a god and 2 men to bring him down, and that Hector himself has very little time left. Then he goes. They fight over the body for a long time. That is not sentiment. In this world, to lose a man's corpse to the enemy is the final catastrophe, because it means no funeral, and no rites, and no place in memory. Menelaus and Ajax stand over him through an afternoon of the worst fighting in the poem, and eventually they get him out. And somebody has to walk down the beach and tell Achilles. Homer does not make you wait for it. Achilles is already standing by his ships, watching the men come back and feeling a dread he cannot name, and when Antilochus reaches him and says the words, Achilles takes the ashes of the fire in both hands and pours them over his own head, and lies down in the dirt, and makes a sound that his mother hears at the bottom of the sea. The women of the camp come running out and beat their breasts. Antilochus holds his hands, afraid he will cut his own throat, and down in the depths, Thetis hears her son crying, and comes up through the water with all her sisters, and she asks him what is wrong, and he tells her, and then he says the thing that ends his story. He is going to kill Hector. And she says, very simply, that if he does, his own death follows immediately after. She has always known the terms. She tells him again now, and he says he does not care. He says he sat by these ships, a useless weight upon the earth, while the man he loved most in the world went out and died, and that whatever comes after, he will not carry that. Sit with this for a moment before we go on. Everything Achilles has done up to this point has been about honor, what he is owed, how he is seen, whether the army values him properly, and every single bit of it stops mattering in the space of one sentence. The prize, the 7 cities, the apology, the tripods, Agamemnon, all of it, gone, irrelevant, not even worth mentioning again. Grief burns off vanity the way heat burns off mist. What is left is very simple and very dangerous, because a man who wants nothing and expects nothing and has nothing left to lose is the most frightening thing on any battlefield. And there is a harder thing underneath, which the poem does not say aloud but arranges very carefully. Patroclus is dead because Achilles was angry. Achilles asked for the Greeks to lose. He got what he asked for, precisely and completely, and the cost of it came out of the one account he never meant to touch. That is the oldest lesson in the story. We are rarely destroyed by our enemies. We are usually destroyed by getting exactly what we demanded. Let the fires burn low. There is a body in a hut on the beach, washed and anointed and covered, and there is a man lying on the ground beside it, who has not moved for hours. Tomorrow he goes out. He has no armor. That is the practical problem, and its solution gives us one of the most beautiful passages in the poem. Thetis goes to Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, and asks him to make new arms for her son. And Homer, at the precise moment when the story is racing towards a killing, stops it dead and spends 400 lines describing a shield. Not its strength, It's pictures. Hephaestus works the whole world onto it in metal. The earth and the sky and the sea, the sun and the moon and the constellations. 2 cities. In the first there are weddings and torches carried through the streets, and music, and a legal dispute being argued in the marketplace before elders sitting on polished stone, with 2 talents of gold laid down for whoever judges most fairly. In the second city there is a siege, and an ambush by a river, and strife and panic walking through the ranks. And then he works the countryside, plowed land, with the plowman turning at the headland, and a cup of wine handed to each as he turns. A harvest, the king standing silent among the sheaves with his heart glad. A vineyard, and a boy playing a lyre and singing a thin, sweet song, while the pickers carry the fruit in baskets. Cattle going down to a river, a pasture in a valley, and last, a dancing floor, with young men and women holding each other by the wrist, turning easily, like a potter's wheel under the hand. Round the outer rim, the great river ocean, which encircles everything. Think about what has just happened. On the shield that Achilles will carry into the fight that kills him, a god has engraved everything he is giving up. Plowing, harvest, weddings, law, music, dancing. The entire life he could have had if he had gone home. He straps it on and goes out. The first thing he does is make peace with Agamemnon, and the scene is almost funny in its brevity. He does not care anymore, he says so. Agamemnon makes a long self-justifying speech, blaming a goddess for clouding his judgment, and Achilles waves it away and asks them to hurry up so he can go and fight. Then the plain. What follows is not a battle so much as a natural disaster. Homer stops naming most of the dead. The Trojans break entirely and run for the city, and Achilles drives them into the river Scamander, and kills so many in the water that the river itself rises up in fury and comes after him, and he is nearly drowned by a god who is simply sick of the bodies. It is an image of a man who has gone beyond the human scale and is being resisted by the landscape. And then the plain empties. The gates of Troy are open, and the last of the army is pouring through, and Priam is on the wall, screaming at his son to come inside. Hector stays outside. Now, Hector, we have not spent enough time with him yet, so let us do it now, because he is the finest human being in this poem, and the tradition has never quite given him his due. He is not the best fighter. He knows it. Achilles is better. Ajax is probably stronger. Diomedes is more dangerous. What Hector has is that he shows up every day for 10 years in a war he did not start, caused by a brother he does not respect, in defense of a decision he thinks was wrong. He tells Paris to his face that he wishes he had never been born. He tells Helen kind things because she is suffering, and it is not her fault that his city is dying. And the poem gives him the scene that no one who has read it ever forgets. Earlier, before all this, he comes back inside the walls briefly, and he goes to find his wife, and he finds her on the tower with the nurse and the baby. And Andromache says to him, "Your courage will kill you." She tells him she has no father, because Achilles killed him, and no mother, and no brothers, because Achilles killed all 7 of them in one day. She says, "You are my father and my mother and my brother now, as well as my husband. Stay on the wall, fight from here." And he says he cannot. He says he would die of shame before the Trojan men and the women with their trailing gowns, if he hung back like a coward. And then he says the truest thing in the poem, that he knows, in his heart and in his bones, that the day will come when sacred Troy will fall, and Priam and all his people with it. He is not fighting because he thinks he will win. He is fighting because he cannot be the man who did not. And then he reaches for his son, and the baby screams and buries his face in the nurse's shoulder, terrified by the bronze and the horsehair crest nodding down at him. And both parents laugh. Hector takes the helmet off and puts it on the ground, and picks up his boy, and kisses him, and prays that people will one day say the son is better than the father. And he gives him back to Andromache, and she takes him, laughing through her tears, Homer says, and Hector strokes her cheek and tells her to go home and see to her work, and puts the helmet back on. That is the man now standing alone outside the gates. His father is begging from the tower, his mother is beside him, and she does something no Greek reader could take lightly. She opens her dress and shows him the breast that fed him, and asks him to come in for that. He does not move, he talks to himself, and Homer lets us hear it. He knows he made an error the night before, keeping the army out on the plain when Achilles returned to the war, and men died for it. He thinks about going in, and cannot bear to be seen. He thinks about laying down his shield and offering to give Helen back and pay double, and he knows there is no negotiating now. And then he sees Achilles coming across the plain, and Homer says he was seized with trembling, and he ran. That is the detail people find hardest. The bravest man in the poem runs away, and it is exactly right and exactly human, and it makes him larger rather than smaller. Courage is not the absence of that. The whole of Hector's life has been the management of that. They run 3 times around the walls of Troy, past the lookout point, past the wild fig tree, past the 2 springs where the Scamander rises, one running warm with steam above it, and one cold as hail even in summer, where the wives and daughters of Troy used to wash their bright clothes in the days of peace, before the Greeks came. Homer puts that in. In the middle of the most famous chase in literature, he stops to tell you that there used to be laundry here, and women talking, and that it was not long ago. And then Athena tricks him. She takes the shape of his brother Deiphobus, and appears beside him and says, "Let us stand together." And Hector, who has been running alone with his heart bursting, turns around, because someone came. There is nobody there. He understands then. He says it aloud. "The gods have called me to my death." And then he says the line that is the whole point of him. He will not die without a fight, and not without doing something great, something that men to come will hear about. The fight is short. It is always short. Achilles knows his own old armor, because Hector is wearing it, and he knows where the collarbone joins the neck, and he puts the spear through there. Hector, dying, asks for one thing, not his life. He asks that his body be given back to his parents for burning, and Achilles refuses. He says he wishes he could eat him raw. He says the dogs and birds will have him, and there will be no funeral, and that no ransom will ever be enough, and Hector dies knowing it. Then Achilles does the thing that is hardest to forgive. He pierces the tendons at the back of the ankles, and threads a leather strap through, and ties the body to his chariot, and drags it, face down, back across the plain to the ships. And on the wall, they watch. The poem gives us Andromache last, and this is why it is the greatest of all poems. She is not on the wall. She is in an inner room of the house, weaving a purple cloth with a pattern of flowers on it, and she has just told the servants to put a cauldron on the fire, so that there will be a hot bath ready for Hector when he comes home from the fighting. Then she hears the sound from the tower. Let all of that settle for a while. Let your breathing go slow. There is nothing being asked of you tonight. The most famous duel in human storytelling lasts a few seconds and is entirely one-sided, and the poet has arranged it so that what you remember afterwards is not the spear at all. It is a baby frightened by a helmet. It is a woman putting water on to heat for a man who is already dead. That is not how you write a war poem if you admire war. For 11 days, Achilles is not a person. He holds funeral games for Patroclus, which are elaborate and strangely calming to read, with chariot races, and boxing, and wrestling, and a foot race, and old grudges settled, and prizes distributed, and Achilles as host, behaving with perfect courtesy to everyone. He is generous, he gives good judgment in a dispute. He is, for a few hundred lines, a civilized man. And every morning, at first light, he goes out and ties Hector's body behind the chariot, and drags it 3 times around the tomb of Patroclus, and then leaves it lying face down in the dust. He cannot sleep. Homer says he tosses from side to side, and gets up and walks along the beach, and watches the dawn come up over the sea, and then goes and does it again. Nothing is helping. That is what the poem is showing you. He has killed the man responsible, and it has not touched the grief by a hair's breadth. And so he keeps going back to the body, looking for something in it that is not there. Even the gods find it intolerable. There is a debate on Olympus, and Apollo says that Achilles has lost all pity and has destroyed the thing in a man that makes him human, and a decision is taken. Thetis is sent to tell her son to accept a ransom, and Iris is sent to Troy, to Priam. Now watch what this old man does. He announces he is going out to the Greek camp, alone, at night, to ask for his son's body. His household tries to stop him. Hecuba tells him the man is a savage and will kill him. He goes anyway. He loads a wagon with treasure, robes, cloaks, tunics, talents of gold, cauldrons, and a great cup that had been given to him as a diplomatic gift years before, which he had kept because it was precious, and which he now gives away without a thought. He takes one old driver, nobody else, and he goes out through his own gates, in the dark, and down across the plain that he has been watching from the walls for 10 years, past the ford of the river, through the lines of an army that has been trying to kill his family for a decade, guided by a young stranger who is the god Hermes in disguise. And he arrives at the hut of the man who killed his son. Homer sets the scene with terrible quiet. Achilles has just finished eating. 2 companions are still clearing away. Nobody sees the old man come in, and Priam walks across the room, and kneels, and takes Achilles' hands in his own, and kisses them. Homer gives it to you plainly. He kissed the terrible man-killing hands that had slaughtered so many of his sons. And then he speaks, and it is only about 40 lines, and it is possibly the finest speech ever put in a human mouth. He does not accuse. He does not plead his rank. He does not mention the war, or the rights of it, or Helen, or Paris, or any of it. He says, "Remember your own father." He says, "Think of him, an old man like me, on the edge of his life, and perhaps his neighbors are pressing him hard, and there is no one to defend him. But at least he has hope. At least he knows you are alive, and he can look forward every day to seeing his son come home from Troy." And then he says, "I had 50 sons when the Greeks came. Most of them are gone now, and the one who kept the city standing, the only one who mattered, you killed a few days ago. I have come to buy him back." And then the last line, and it is the one that breaks everything open. "I have endured what no man on earth has ever endured. I have put my lips to the hand of the man who killed my child." And Homer says that Achilles took the old man's hand and gently pushed him away, and that the 2 of them wept. Priam crouched at Achilles' feet crying for Hector, and Achilles cried for his father, and then for Patroclus, and the sound of it filled the hut. 2 men, on opposite sides of the worst thing either of them has ever known, crying in the same room for different people. Then Achilles gets up and takes Priam by the hand and lifts him to his feet and says, "Come, sit down, and let us let our sorrows lie quiet in our hearts, for there is nothing to be gained by weeping. That is how the gods have spun it for us, to live in sorrow, while they themselves are without care." He tells him about the 2 jars that stand on the floor of Zeus's house, one of evils and one of blessings, and how the god gives to some a mixture of both, and to some only from the jar of sorrows. And then Achilles does something extraordinarily practical and extraordinarily kind. He tells Priam to eat. He says, "Even Niobe ate, even she, who lost 12 children in a single day and wept until she turned to stone, even she remembered her food. So let us eat, and afterwards we will weep for your son as much as you like, when you have taken him home." And he goes out and kills a sheep himself, and his men prepare it, and the 2 of them sit and eat together. And then, Homer says, they looked at each other. Priam marveled at Achilles, at how tall and how beautiful he was, like one of the gods, and Achilles marveled at Priam, at his noble face, and the sound of his voice. They sat there in the middle of the war and admired each other. Achilles has beds made up outside the hut, and he asks Priam, carefully, how many days he needs for the funeral. Priam says 11, and asks for a truce. And Achilles says, "It shall be as you wish. I will hold back the army for as long as you need." And he takes the old man's wrist by the hand, at the joint, so that he will not be afraid. Then Priam sleeps. Homer notes it specifically. It is the first proper sleep he has had. And in the last of the darkness, Hermes wakes him and gets him out, before Agamemnon can find out he is there, and the wagon goes back across the plain, with the body wrapped in the robes that were brought to buy it. And the first person to see them coming is Cassandra, up early on the walls in the grey light. The Iliad ends with a funeral, not with the fall of Troy, not with the horse, which is not in it at all, not with Achilles' death, which the poem promises repeatedly and never shows. It ends with 9 days of gathering firewood, and a pyre, and the fire quenched with wine, and the white bones picked out and wrapped in soft purple, and put in a golden box, and a barrow raised, and a meal in the house of Priam. The last line of the poem is about the burial of Hector, breaker of horses. That is where the greatest war story ever told chooses to stop. Not at a victory. At the moment 2 enemies managed for a single night to see each other as people, and at the funeral that moment made possible. Let that be with you for a moment in the dark. The whole architecture of the poem, 24 books and 15,000 lines of anger and slaughter and divine interference, exists to arrive at an old man and a young man weeping together in a hut on a beach, and then sharing a meal. It is, in the end, a poem about mercy arriving late. The fire on the plain has burned down to embers now. The mourners have gone back inside the walls. The gates are shut again, and the watch is set, and the city sleeps around the new tomb. They have 11 days. Everything that follows is outside the Iliad. That is worth saying clearly, because most people assume the wooden horse is the climax of Homer's poem, and it is not in it at all. The Iliad ends with Hector's funeral. The events between that funeral and the fall of the city came down through other poems, now lost, which ancient scholars grouped together as the epic cycle, with titles like the Aethiopis, the Little Iliad, and the Sack of Ilion. We know them only from summaries, quotations, and the works of much later writers, principally Virgil, who wrote his account 700 years afterwards for a Roman audience with entirely different purposes. So the further we go now, the thinner the thread becomes. First, the deaths. Achilles kept his promise to himself and did not live long. 2 figures arrive to help Troy after Hector's death, and both are killed by him, and both killings deepen him rather than exalting him. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, is said to have fought him and fallen, and tradition adds that as he lifted her helmet, he saw her face and was undone by it, having killed the one person on the field who might have understood him. Then Memnon, king of the Ethiopians, son of the dawn, who kills Achilles' friend Antilochus and is killed in turn, and whose mother mourns him every morning, which is why there is dew. And then Achilles himself, at the Scaean gate, shot by Paris with an arrow guided by Apollo. In the older tradition, the wound is not specified. The heel comes into the story later, along with the river Styx, and by then it has hardened into the version everyone knows. His armor was awarded to Odysseus rather than to Ajax, by a vote of the army, and Ajax, who had carried the Greek line on his back for 10 years and had never once been helped by a god, could not survive the insult. He went mad and then he killed himself, and Sophocles made a great play out of it, and it remains one of the most unsparing accounts of a soldier's collapse ever written. Paris was killed too, by an arrow, which has a certain symmetry. So the great figures are going out one by one, and the war has not moved. The walls are exactly where they were in the first year. Troy is weaker and the Greek army is smaller and older, and neither of those facts has changed the arithmetic. 10 years of the finest warriors in the world, and the gate is still shut. And so, the trick. Odysseus conceives it, which surprises nobody. A hollow horse of wood, enormous, built from the timbers of the ships, with a hidden chamber inside. The army burns its camp and sails away over the horizon to the island of Tenedos and waits there. Left behind on the empty beach, the horse and one man. His name is Sinon, and his job is to lie. The Trojans come out in the morning and find the shore deserted for the first time in 10 years. Try to feel that. 10 years of smoke and noise on that beach, and one morning it is gone, and there is nothing but scorched ground and gulls, and the marks where 1,000 keels had rested. They walk among the remains of the camp, like people wandering through a dream, and there is this thing standing in the middle of it, and there is a Greek in chains who tells them a story about being left for sacrifice by his own side, and about the horse being an offering to Athena, built deliberately too large to be brought through the gates, because if the Trojans ever got it inside, the city could never be taken, which is, of course, precisely the way to make certain they will bring it inside. Not everyone is fooled. Cassandra says exactly what it is and is not believed, because she never is, and a priest called Larucon throws a spear into its flank and says the line that has outlived everything else in the story, that he fears the Greeks even when they bring gifts. In Virgil's account, 2 enormous serpents come out of the sea and take him, and both his sons, and that ends the debate. The great sculpture of that scene, carved centuries later, was found in Rome in 1506, and astonished the artists of the Renaissance, Michelangelo among them. So they take down part of the wall, or widen the gate, depending on the version, and they haul it in, and they garland it, and they celebrate, and they drink, because the war is over, and they have won. And in the dark, Sinon lights a beacon, and the fleet comes back from Tenedos with muffled oars. Now let us do what we always do, and turn this over in the light. Is there anything in it? Take the literal reading first. A hollow wooden horse containing warriors is not impossible, in the way that a talking river is impossible, but it is extremely improbable. The engineering is awkward. Men would need to be inside it for many hours in silence in the heat, and the plan depends on a defended city, after a 10-year siege, voluntarily dismantling its own fortifications to accommodate a suspicious object left by an enemy who has vanished. It requires a level of stupidity that the story otherwise does not attribute to the Trojans. So historians have offered alternatives, and they are worth laying out, with the honest caveat that all of them are speculation and none can be tested. The first is that the horse is a siege engine, misremembered. The Assyrians, in the same broad period and rather better documented, used covered battering rams and mobile assault towers, and Assyrian reliefs show them. Such machines were sometimes given animal names. A wooden structure, wheeled up to the wall, full of men, which allowed attackers to get inside a city that had held for years, is not a bad description of a siege tower, and a poetic tradition working 4 centuries later, in an age that had forgotten how such things were built, might very reasonably have preserved the image and lost the mechanism. The second is the earthquake. This one is attractive because of the god involved. Poseidon, in Greek religion, is not only the sea, he is also the earth shaker, and he is very strongly associated with horses. A horse that breaks the walls of Troy is, symbolically, an earthquake. And here the archaeology is genuinely interesting, because excavators have concluded that an earlier phase of the city, Troy 6, really was brought down by an earthquake, with the collapse visible in the fabric of the buildings. The idea would be that a real seismic event breached the defenses and let the attackers in, and that the memory of it survived in the form of the god's animal. The third is simply treachery. Someone opened a gate. It is the most common way fortified cities actually fall, in every period of history, and it is the least romantic thing imaginable. And the story of a man left behind to tell a convincing lie may be a memory of exactly that, dressed up. And the fourth possibility is that it is a story, and only ever was. A tale told about cleverness defeating strength, invented by a culture that admired cleverness and needed to explain how the war had ended after so long. Choose whichever you like. Nobody knows. What can be said is that the Greeks themselves seem to have had the horse in the tradition very early, because Homer refers to it in the Odyssey, when a bard sings about it in a hall, and Odysseus weeps to hear his own story. Let the plain go quiet now. The horse is inside the walls. The gates are shut behind it. The city is drunk and singing and asleep for the first easy night in a decade. And there are lamps burning in windows that have not been open after dark for years. Out on the black water, a fleet is coming back without lights. This is the hardest chapter, and I am going to tell it plainly and without dwelling, because there is nothing to be gained from lingering over it, and the tradition itself has always understood that. They came in at the darkest hour, when the drink had done its work, and even the watch had gone soft. The men in the horse came down on ropes. The gates were opened from the inside, and the army that had been waiting on the beach came up through the streets of a city that had gone to bed, believing it was safe. Virgil, writing his account for Rome, gives it to us through the eyes of a man waking up. Aeneas is asleep and dreams that Hector comes to him, not as he was, but as he was at the end, disfigured and filthy, and tells him to run, to take the household gods and go, because Troy is finished and there is nothing to defend. And Aeneas wakes, and climbs to the roof, and the whole city is burning. The image Virgil uses is of a shepherd standing on a rock in the mountains, hearing a roaring below, and not understanding what it is, a fire in the corn, or a torrent coming down after rain, taking the fields and the oxen and everything. What follows is what always follows. Fighting in the dark in narrow streets, in which nobody can tell friend from enemy, and men die at the hands of their own side. Roofs coming down. People running towards places that are already gone. Small groups making stands in courtyards and being overwhelmed. Priam put on his armor. That is the detail I want you to keep. An old man, who has not fought for 30 years, whose hands shake, buckling on a breastplate that no longer fits him, because he cannot sit still while it happens. His wife tells him to stop. She tells him that no armor will help him now, and she takes him to the altar in the courtyard where the household gods are, under an old laurel tree, and makes him sit there with her. And then their son Polites runs into the courtyard, wounded, with a Greek behind him, and is killed in front of them. The man who kills him is Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, who was a boy on the island of Skyros when this war began, and has come to it late, and who has none of his father's complications. And Priam, who has done nothing at all for the whole poem except endure, stands up and throws a spear. It is a feeble throw. It does not even penetrate the shield, and he says, roughly, that Achilles himself, whatever else he was, respected a suppliant and gave him back his son's body, and that this man is nothing like his father, and Neoptolemus kills him at his own altar. Virgil ends the passage with a line that has echoed for 2,000 years, that he who was once the ruler of so many peoples and lands lay there, a great trunk upon the shore, the head torn from the shoulders, a body without a name. The rest is what happens to cities. Hecuba was taken, Andromache was taken, Cassandra was dragged from the temple of Athena, and the manner of it was so offensive to the goddess that she turned against the Greeks and made their voyage home a disaster. Polyxena was killed at the tomb of Achilles, and Astyanax, the baby who was frightened by his father's helmet, was thrown from the walls, because a boy who grows up will avenge his father, and the Greeks had learned that lesson from their own stories. The Greek tragedians went at this material again and again, and it is important to understand why. Euripides wrote The Trojan Women in 415 before the Common Era, and he put it in front of an Athenian audience, the year after Athens had destroyed the island of Melos, killed its men, and enslaved its women and children. His play does not have a hero. It has 4 women sitting in the ruins waiting to be allocated to the men who killed their families, and it is the earliest surviving work of Western literature to look steadily at a military victory and show only what it costs. The Greeks told this story about themselves. That is the thing to hold on to. It was their victory, their ancestors, their triumph, and their greatest writers used it to say, "Look what we are capable of. Look what winning actually looks like from underneath." Some got out. Aeneas is the great survivor, and Virgil follows him, leaving the burning city with his father Anchises on his back, his small son by the hand, and his wife somewhere behind in the dark, and she does not make it, and he goes back for her, and finds only her ghost. And then the ships, and the long wandering, and eventually Italy, and 7 centuries later, Rome. That is the Roman claim to descent from Troy, and the Emperor Augustus, whose family traced itself to Aeneas, had every political reason to want the poem written. The Greeks did not sail away into a happy ending either. Almost none of them did. Agamemnon reached Mycenae, and was murdered in his own house by his wife and her lover, 10 years to the day after he stood on a beach at Aulis, and let his daughter be killed for a wind. Ajax the Lesser drowned. Menelaus and Helen were blown to Egypt and wandered for years, and eventually came home to Sparta and lived out their lives together, which is either a reconciliation or a very long silence, depending on how you read the passage in the Odyssey, where a visitor watches them being polite to each other. And Odysseus took 10 years to travel a journey of a few weeks, and lost every man he had, and arrived home alone and unrecognized, and had to fight for his own house. Nobody wins the Trojan War. That is the tradition's verdict, delivered consistently across 1,000 years of Greek and Roman literature. The city is destroyed and the victors are scattered and cursed and murdered in their baths. And within a century or so of these events, the whole Mycenaean world will collapse anyway. Palaces burned, writing lost, populations gone. In the great catastrophe historians call the Bronze Age collapse. The fire on the hill burns all night and into the morning. By the time the sun is properly up, there is nothing left standing that will still be standing in a year. The smoke goes out across the plain and out over the strait, and thins into nothing, and the ships load and pull away one by one. And the hill is quiet, and it stays quiet for a while, and then, because the position is too good to leave empty, someone comes back and starts building on top of the ash. For most of the last 3,000 years, nobody believed any of this had happened. The classical Greeks did. Alexander the Great visited the site and made offerings at what he was told was the tomb of Achilles, and took a shield from the temple there and carried it through Asia. Julius Caesar visited. The Romans built a substantial city there, called Ilium, and it was still going in late antiquity. But by the 18th and 19th centuries, scholarly opinion had hardened the other way. Troy was a fable. Homer was literature and nothing else, and looking for Troy was like looking for the garden where the golden apples grew. Educated men were quite firm about it. Which brings us to a most peculiar person. Heinrich Schliemann was born in Germany in 1822, the son of a pastor, and he was not a scholar of any kind. He was a businessman, and an exceptionally successful one. He made money in indigo, and then made a great deal more supplying materials during the Crimean War, and then more again in the gold trade in California. He had a genuine gift for languages, teaching himself something in the region of a dozen, and he had, or claimed to have, a lifelong conviction that Homer was describing real places. The claim is worth flagging as a claim. Schliemann was an inveterate self-mythologizer, and modern historians have shown that a number of the charming stories he told about himself, including the tale that his father showed him a picture of burning Troy when he was 7, and that he vowed then to find it, appear to have been invented later. He also, on occasion, adjusted his excavation diaries after the fact. Nor was it his idea to dig where he dug. The mound at Hisarlik had been proposed as the site by others before him, and in particular an Englishman named Frank Calvert, who owned part of the land, had already begun digging there and was convinced. Calvert shared his reasoning with Schliemann. Schliemann took it and the credit, and Calvert spent the rest of his life in the shadow of it. Schliemann began work at Hisarlik in 1870, and what he did next was both magnificent and appalling. He cut a trench, not a careful sondage, an enormous gash straight through the middle of the mound, 40 meters wide, driven down through everything, because he wanted the oldest city, and he assumed the oldest was the one he wanted. Layer after layer came out and went onto the spoil heaps, and the layer he blasted through with the least attention was, as it turned out, precisely the one that later archaeologists would identify as the likeliest candidate for Homer's Troy. We will never know what was in it. That material is gone. It is one of the great losses in the history of the discipline, and it was inflicted by the man who made the site famous. In 1873, he announced a spectacular find, a cache of gold and silver and copper objects, diadems, cups, jewelry, thousands of small gold beads and rings. He called it Priam's treasure, and he had his young Greek wife Sophia photographed wearing the diadems, and the image went around the world. It is not Priam's. The objects come from a level roughly 1,000 years earlier than any plausible Trojan War, which is to say that Schliemann had found a genuine and important early Bronze Age hoard and had attached to it a name from a poem. The circumstances of the find are murky. The account he gave changed over time, and he smuggled the material out of Ottoman territory, which led to a lawsuit. The treasure went to Berlin, vanished at the end of the Second World War, and turned up in Moscow in the 1990s, where much of it remains. Schliemann then went to Mycenae in 1876 and found the shaft graves and the gold masks, and sent a telegram claiming he had gazed upon the face of Agamemnon. That is not Agamemnon either. The graves are around 300 years too early. He was wrong about nearly every specific identification he ever made. And he was right about the thing that mattered, which is that there was a real Bronze Age civilization in Greece, of enormous wealth and sophistication, and a real fortified city at Hisarlik, and that Homer's world was not made of nothing. After him, the discipline grew up. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, who had trained as an architect and had worked at Olympia, took over the site in the 1890s and did what Schliemann had not. He sorted out the stratigraphy. He identified the great walls of the sixth city and argued that this was the Homeric one. Then Carl Blegen, of the University of Cincinnati, excavated through the 1930s and refined it further. Blegen concluded that the sixth city had come down in an earthquake and that the settlement built immediately afterwards, which he labeled Troy Sevener, had been destroyed by human beings. His evidence for that is worth listing, because it is the closest thing to a smoking gun in the whole story. Arrowheads found lodged in the walls, unburied human remains lying in the streets and inside houses, widespread burning, and a pattern of hurried adaptation inside the citadel. Small, cramped structures crowded into what had been open space, and large storage jars sunk into the floors, which is what you do when a population from the surrounding countryside has crowded inside the walls and you are preparing to hold out. Kaufmann's team from 1988 onwards confirmed and extended this. They found the lower town. They found evidence of the earthquake damage to the sixth city and of warfare in the seventh. In one case, a house destroyed by the earthquake, with another built directly on top of its ruins, and then burned. They found skeletons and heaps of sling bullets lying where they fell, which is an unexpectedly eloquent detail. Kaufmann pointed out that a garrison which had successfully defended its city would have gathered its ammunition back up and stored it for next time. Sling bullets left scattered in the ruins are the ammunition of the side that lost. And afterwards, in the layer called Troy 7b, the pottery changes, the architecture changes, and the material culture suggests different people living there. The dating has been refined over the years. Blegen initially placed the fall around 1250. Later analysis of the pottery, particularly by Penelope Mountjoy, Put the destruction at roughly 1210 to 1190, before the Common Era, and the figure most often cited now is around 1180. Excavation at the site continues, now under Turkish direction, with Rustem Aslan, the first Turkish citizen to lead the work since digging began in 1870. Modern methods are non-invasive wherever possible. Geophysical survey, careful stratigraphy, the reading of what Schliemann left rather than the removal of what remains. So this is where we have arrived. There was a city. It was rich and strategically placed and heavily fortified. It was destroyed by fire in a war at a date that is startlingly close to the one Greek tradition remembered. What nobody has found, and what nobody is ever going to find, is a name. There is no inscription at Hisarlik saying who attacked it, no tablet listing the dead, no shield with Achilles' name on it. The archaeology can tell you that a fortified late Bronze Age city was sacked. It cannot tell you who did it, or why, or whether anyone involved was called Hector. Let that sit, in the dark, for a moment. Somewhere in that hill, under 3,000 years of other people's cities, is a layer of ash a few centimeters thick. Everything we have talked about tonight either happened in that ash, or did not. So, how much of it is true? Let us take it apart gently, in layers, the way the archaeologists took apart the hill. And let your body stay heavy while we do it. Nothing here needs solving tonight. Start with what is solid. There was a city at Hisarlik. It was occupied for more than 3,000 years, across 9 major phases. It was fortified with impressive walls in the late Bronze Age. It sat at a choke point on one of the most important sea routes in the world. It was wealthy, and it traded widely. It was destroyed by fire around 1180 before the Common Era, with strong evidence of human violence rather than accident. There was a Mycenaean civilization in Greece, contemporary with that city, capable of building great fortresses and sending fleets across the Aegean, with kings and a warrior aristocracy who buried their dead with extraordinary quantities of weapons and gold. They spoke Greek. They traded and raided across the eastern Mediterranean. That much is not in dispute by anyone. Now the layer above it, which is thinner but still holds weight. The Hittite archives, unearthed at Hattusa and read over the past century, refer repeatedly to a land in the northwest of Anatolia that they call Wilusa, and in at least one text to a place called Taruisa. Wilusa maps very plausibly onto the Greek Ilios, and Taruisa onto Troia. The archives also refer to a power across the water called Ahiyawa, which most scholars now accept refers to the Mycenaean Greeks, and whose name resembles the word Homer uses for the Greeks, Achaeans. The Hittites record friction. They record a treaty with a ruler of Wilusa, whose name is written Alexandru, which looks very much like the Greek Alexandros, which is the second name Homer gives to Paris. They record a god guaranteeing that treaty, whose name is written Apollonius, which appears to be Apollo, who in the poem is Troy's fiercest divine defender, and in a letter sent by a Hittite king to a king of Ahiyawa, usually called the Tawagalawa letter, and dated to around 1250, there is a reference to a past dispute between the two powers over Wilusa. There is also, in the same period, a persistent troublemaker named Pia Maradu, operating in western Anatolia with apparent Ahiyawan backing. So here is what the archives give us, stated as carefully as it deserves. Real Greeks, and a real place called something like Ilios, in real conflict, in the right region, in the right century, with names that echo the poem. What the archives do not give us is a war. They give us decades of friction, raids, rebellions, proxy conflicts, and diplomatic irritation across the western edge of Anatolia over a period of 200 years or more. And that has led a good many scholars, Eric Klein among them, to what is probably the most honest position available. Rather than looking for one clean historical Trojan War, we should perhaps understand the tradition as a distillation, Generations of intermittent conflict between Mycenaean Greeks and the peoples of Western Anatolia, compressed by centuries of oral retelling into a single decisive war, fought by a single generation of heroes over a single cause. Manfred Kaufmann, who dug there for 17 years, put it about as fairly as it can be put. He said that on the evidence, several armed conflicts in and around Troy at the end of the Late Bronze Age now seem more likely than not, that we do not know whether one of them was especially memorable or whether many were folded together, and that everything currently suggests Homer should be taken seriously as preserving a memory of real events, whatever those events actually were. And when people asked him directly whether the Trojan War happened there, his answer, as an archaeologist standing on the site, was simply, why not? Now the layer above that, which is where evidence runs out and judgment begins. The poem preserves things that were genuinely old when it was composed. The boar tusk helmet, which had gone out of use centuries before Homer, and which archaeologists have since dug up. The great body shield. The catalogue of ships, which describes a political map of Greece that fits the Bronze Age rather than the 8th century. A bronze-using world in which iron is mentioned only rarely and as something precious. These are fossils inside the verse, carried down by generations of singers who did not know what they were preserving. But the poem also gets things wrong, or rather, gets things from the wrong century. Its chariots are used in a way that does not match the tablets. Some of its burial customs are of Homer's own age, not of the Bronze Age. Its social world, with its independent chieftains and its gift exchange, looks in places much more like the early Iron Age. That is exactly what you would expect. 400 years of oral transmission across a period in which writing itself was lost is not a recording device. It is a river. Things fall in, and things dissolve, and things are carried a long way from where they started. And then the top layer, which is pure story. The apple, the judgment, the goddesses, the oath sworn on a horse's body, the invulnerable heel, the gods on the battlefield, almost certainly Helen, in any recoverable sense, very probably the horse. None of it happened. All of it is true in the other way, the way a poem is true, which is that it accurately records what human beings are like. So if you want a single sentence to take away, it might be this. There was probably a war, or a long series of wars, over a real and valuable city, fought for reasons that were almost certainly commercial and strategic. And human beings, being what they are, could not bear to remember it that way. So they remembered it as a story about a beautiful woman, and a young man's bad choice, and a friend who died, and an old man who kissed the hands of his son's killer. We remembered the wrong things on purpose. And because we did, it lasted. Let that settle now. Let your jaw unclench. Let the question go unanswered, because it is going to be unanswered for the rest of your life, and the rest of everyone's. And there is a real peace in a question that nobody has to solve tonight. The strangest thing about the fall of Troy is how much of the modern world came out of it. Start with Rome, because Rome staked its identity on it. The Romans decided, at some point in their expansion, that they were not Greeks and did not descend from Greeks, and they needed an origin that was ancient and dignified and not Athenian. So they took the losing side. They claimed descent from Aeneas, the Trojan prince who escaped the fire carrying his father on his back, and Virgil wrote the Aeneid to give that claim its definitive form. Julius Caesar's family claimed descent from Aeneas's son. Augustus made the connection state policy, which produced an astonishing situation. The greatest empire the ancient Mediterranean ever saw traced its bloodline to a defeated city and cast itself as the vindication of a people who had lost. And when Rome in turn fell, and the kingdoms of medieval Europe went looking for pedigrees, they did the same thing. Britain acquired a founding myth involving a Trojan called Brutus. The Franks claimed Trojan descent. London was called New Troy in the chronicles. For the better part of 2,000 years, The highest claim a European dynasty could make about itself was that it had come from a city that burned. Then the literature. The Iliad and the Odyssey stand at the head of the entire Western literary tradition, and there is nothing before them of comparable scale that survives. Every epic afterwards is written with them in view. Virgil answers Homer directly. Dante takes Virgil as his guide. Milton writes against both. Joyce structures a day in Dublin on the Odyssey. Derek Walcott moves the whole thing to the Caribbean. And in the last few decades, a wave of novelists, most of them women, have gone back into it to tell it from inside the tents where the captured women lived, which is arguably the most interesting thing that has happened to the material in a very long time. Greek tragedy is largely built on this war. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides return to the house of Atreus and the aftermath of Troy again and again, and in doing so they invented dramatic structure and character in the modern sense, and the idea that an audience might watch a story in order to think about a moral problem rather than to be entertained. Then the visual arts. Painted pottery in the archaic period, temple sculpture, Roman wall painting, the Laocoon, dug up in Rome in 1506, which changed Renaissance sculpture almost overnight, Rubens and Poussin, and David and Tiepolo. And in the modern era, film after film after film, with each generation making its Achilles look like whatever that generation admires. Then the language, which is where it gets almost domestic. You have an Achilles tendon. The Greeks did not name it, anatomists did, in the 17th century, borrowing the story. Achilles' heel, for a single fatal weakness in something otherwise strong. Trojan Horse, for a gift that is an attack, which computer security borrowed wholesale in the 1970s, and which is now probably the most common daily use of the entire legend. Siren, from the Odyssey, for the sound that pulls you towards danger. Odyssey itself, for any long transformative journey. Mentor, from the name of the man Odysseus left in charge of his son's education, between Scylla and Charybdis. A face that launched 1,000 ships, which is not Homer at all, but Christopher Marlowe, 16th century. Then the harder inheritance. Military academies still teach the Iliad, and not for tactics, because the tactics are useless. They teach it because it is the most accurate account ever written of what happens inside an army. The quarrel between political authority and battlefield competence. The corrosive effect of unequal reward. The way grief converts into atrocity. The difficulty of ending a war that has outlived its purpose. And in the last 30 years, the poem has found an unexpected role in medicine. The American classicist and clinician Jonathan Shea wrote a book called Achilles in Vietnam, comparing the experiences of combat veterans with the Iliad, and arguing that Homer had described, with clinical precision, the sequence that produces lasting psychological injury, the betrayal of what is right by a commander, the loss of a close comrade, and the berserk state that follows. Veterans reading it have reported recognizing themselves. A poem 400 years older than writing in Greece turns out to describe post-traumatic injury better than most 20th century textbooks. And then there is psychology, and the general vocabulary of the interior life. Narcissism, nemesis, Cassandra as a name for the person who tells the truth and is disbelieved, which has become a term used seriously in organizational analysis. The whole habit of using myth as a map for the mind, which runs through Freud and Jung and out into ordinary speech. Let all of that drift past you slowly, like the coastline from a ship. A city burned on a hill in Anatolia 3,200 years ago, and a piece of it is in your tendon, and in your computer's antivirus software, and in the ambulance going past at night, and in the word you use for a difficult journey. That is a strange kind of afterlife. But it is an afterlife. We are near the end now, and this is the part where I would ordinarily try to tell you what it all means. And I am not going to do that, because the story is better at it than I am. So instead, let me simply set a few things down beside each other, and let you take whichever ones are useful, and leave the rest. Let your eyes stay closed. Let the pillow take the whole weight of your head. There is nothing left to follow. The first is about pride. Agamemnon takes a girl he does not want from a man he cannot afford to lose, for no reason except that he cannot be seen to yield. Achilles withdraws over an insult that was real, and is right about the insult, and the rightness costs him everything he loves. Ajax cannot survive a vote. Paris cannot decline a competition. Not one catastrophe in this story is caused by an enemy. Every single one is caused by a man defending his own standing, and what the poem observes, quietly and repeatedly, is that a wound to pride feels exactly like a wound to justice, from the inside, and that almost nobody can tell the difference in the moment. The second is about what winning is. Every Greek in this story achieves the objective. The city falls. And then Agamemnon is murdered in his bath. Ajax is dead by his own hand. Achilles is dead before the walls come down. Odysseus loses 10 more years, and every man he brought with him, and the entire civilization that sent them collapses within a century. Meanwhile, the losers, the Trojans, become the ancestors of Rome and the founding myth of half of Europe. Nobody in the story gets what they wanted by getting what they wanted. The third is about mercy and the timing of it. The single most important scene in the entire tradition is two men crying in a hut. Nothing is solved by it. Hector is still dead. Troy still falls a few weeks later. Achilles still dies. Priam still dies at his own altar. And yet it is the scene everything is built towards. And every reader for 3,000 years has known that it is the summit of the poem. Because what happens there is that two people, at the absolute extremity of grief and hatred, look at each other and see a person rather than a position, and it changes nothing about the outcome, and it is still the most valuable thing that happens. Mercy that arrives too late to prevent the disaster is still mercy. It is, in fact, the only kind most of us are ever offered, and the story insists that it counts. The fourth is about memory, and this one is the reason we are here. Achilles was given a choice, and it was a genuinely free one. A long life at home, ordinary and warm, ending in old age among people who loved him, and after that, nothing, or a short life, and a name that would outlast the language it was spoken in. He chose the name, and the poem gives him the honor of that choice, and then does something remarkable with it. In the Odyssey, Odysseus goes down to the land of the dead and meets him there, and tells him that he is honored among the shades as he was among the living, that he should not grieve, and Achilles tells him not to console him for dying. He says he would rather be a hired laborer working the fields for a landless man with nothing, alive, than be king over all the perished dead. He had the fame. He had exactly what he traded his life for, and given the chance to speak honestly, from the other side, he says it was not worth it. That is one of the bravest passages in literature, and it is not there by accident. It is the tradition auditing itself. Having spent an entire epic celebrating glory won at the cost of a life, it goes back afterwards and asks the man who made the trade whether he would do it again, and lets him say no. The fifth is the smallest one, and it is the one I find myself returning to. Homer, in the middle of the greatest chase scene ever written, with Hector running for his life and death coming up behind him, stops to tell you about the washing places. Two springs beside the walls, one warm and one cold, with wide stone basins where the wives and daughters of Troy used to wash their bright clothes in the days of peace, before the sons of the Aegeans came. He did not have to include that. The story does not need it. And it is the thing that breaks people, because it is the ordinary world glimpsed through the gap in the wall of a catastrophe. Women talking while they work, clean laundry, an ordinary morning that everybody assumed would keep happening. The war does not take away a great civilization. It takes away a laundry day. That is what is really at stake, in this story and in every other one. Not glory and not honor, and not the fate of nations. The completely unremarkable afternoon that you are not paying attention to because you assume there will be another one. You are having one now, in a way. This quiet hour, wherever you are, with the light off and the day finished and nothing required of you. It is the most ordinary thing in the world. It is also, in the long arithmetic of history, the rarest and most precious condition a human being can be in. Safe, warm, unhurried, and at peace. Let it be enough for tonight. It is. So let us go back to where we started. Stand on the shoreline one last time, but not in the Bronze Age now. Stand there today. The sea has moved. 3,000 years of silt from 2 rivers have pushed the coast several kilometers out, and the bay where the ships were drawn up is now a flat green plain of cotton and wheat. The strait is still there, and still busy, because geography does not change its mind. Ships still queue to go north. They are made of steel now, and they do not care about the wind, but they follow exactly the same line through the water that the black hulls followed, because there is only one way through, and the hill is still there. It is smaller than you expect. It is a low mound with a fence around it and a path, and a great deal of exposed stone, and long grass moving in the wind that comes off the strait. There are poppies in the spring. There are tortoises, apparently, in some numbers. There is a modern wooden horse near the entrance for the visitors, which is entirely absurd, and which everyone photographs anyway. And there are the walls. That is the thing to hold at the end. A stretch of the great sloping limestone circuit is still standing, still fitted, still leaning inward as it rises, exactly as it was laid by hands that have been dust for 130 generations. You can put your palm flat against it. Everything else is gone. The kings and the ships and the arguments and the treasure and the names. Whatever the war was actually about, whoever actually died here, whatever the truth was, it went into the ground, and the ground kept it. And yet here we are, 3,200 years later, on the other side of the world, in a language those people could not have imagined. In the dark, at the end of a day they could not have pictured, we are still talking about them. That is worth sitting with as you drift. Every civilization in this story ended. The Mycenaeans collapsed within a century of the fall. The Hittites collapsed at the same time, and were so thoroughly forgotten that nobody knew they had existed until archaeologists found their archives in the 20th century. Troy was rebuilt and finally abandoned. Rome came and went. The great palaces became fields. Nothing anyone built survived, but somebody sang about it, and a poem, which is the least solid thing in this entire story, made of nothing but breath and memory and rhythm, carried by people who could not write, passed hand to hand across 400 dark years, outlasted every wall and every empire and every treasury of gold. Stone did not last. Bronze did not last. The story lasted. And it lasted not because it was about a great victory, but because somewhere in it, a frightened baby laughed at a helmet, and a woman put water on to heat for a man who was already dead, and 2 enemies sat down and ate a meal together and could not stop looking at each other's faces. That is what human beings decided to keep. The waves are moving on the shore below the mound, in the dark, the way they were moving on the morning we began. The stars are out over the plain. The old stones are cooling. Somewhere out on the water, a light is going slowly north through the strait, following the line that everything has always followed. And you are here, warm, safe, and finished with the day. Let your breathing find the rhythm of the water, in and out, slow, unhurried, nothing to solve. The city is quiet, the sea is quiet, you are quiet. Let it all go now. Thank you for joining me on another journey through history. Sleep well, keep learning, and remember that the greatest treasures are often found in the quietest moments. This has been Sleep into Power. Good night.
you.